67, 6-day war. John, that was a 6-day war of convenience. This is not going to be 6 days.
And we're curious about how this really does evolve and escalate through the region, John. I think we're all watching that very closely.
Without a doubt. Equities this morning, negative 0.6% on the S&P. In the commodity market, crude higher by 3.8% on WTI, up by 3.6% on Brent crude, getting closer to $90, $87 and around about 70 cents. From New York, Bloomberg's Anne-Marie, up next.
The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
I see a world where financial conditions have gotten tighter, and the transition mechanism, which the Fed would like to see in slowing down the economy, which we all expected, it's taken a lot longer. So the real impact of higher costs around the globe, in the U.S. and Western Europe, it's not been felt yet. And so when people say, well, we're going to have a soft landing, I'm skeptical.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
What do you consider to be the biggest challenge?
Infrastructure that supports trade is the biggest challenge. Our senior brother, President Adesina of the AFDB, estimates the annual deficit, infrastructure deficit in Africa to be over $100 billion. But that over $100 billion is actually also an opportunity for investment. So it is a massive, a significant challenge that we are confronting, and my fear is that we may succeed in establishing a very effective legal construct and a very effective legal foundation for trade liberalization and investment liberalization in Africa. But all of that will come to naught if the infrastructure deficit is not addressed, because you will need the goods to move somehow, and you will need to have good trade corridor connectivity, ports, trade corridors that connect countries that are landlocked to the ports.
The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
The market is starting to look over the Fed's moves into falling interest rates.
We actually think that core inflation is going to fall a little faster than the Fed expects, and that will allow them to start cutting rates by March of next year.
You get a price spiral when labor markets are tight. In manufacturing, labor markets are still very tight right now in the US.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
The boundaries of the entertainment world are blurry, and they're all scrambling for the same thing, screen time. And navigating this multiverse is no simple task. At Bloomberg Screen Time, it's culture, business, converged. Bloomberg Screen Time, Naya Studios, Los Angeles, October 11th and 12th. Get your tickets at bloomberglive.com/screentime.
Today, the people of Israel are under attack, orchestrated by a terrorist organization, Hamas.
It's incomprehensible, and we're still waking up and hoping it's a nightmare.
This is Israel's 9/11, and Israel will do everything to bring our sons and daughters back home.
We chose the peaceful path to achieve our rights. But Israel continued using blunt force against Palestinian lives and Palestinian rights.
The United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Tragic pictures over the weekend. Live from New York City this morning. Good morning. For our audience worldwide, this is Bloomberg Surveillance on TV and radio. Alongside Tom Keene and Elisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Your equity market negative by 0.6% on the S&P 500. Tom, the conflict between Israel and Hamas entering day 3.
It's day 3, and it's the top of list because it's extremely dynamic right now. We're looking at the headlines coming out moment by moment, summaries of the action, if you will, in the Gaza Strip, and frankly, outside the Gaza Strip is just as important. And of course, the diplomacy or non-diplomacy through the day. Day 3 has got to be front and center.
Day 3, and I think for a third day asking the same question, Elise, we've asked it all morning. How did this happen?
And one thing that we were just hearing from Isaac Boltansky is it wasn't just an intelligence failure by Israel, but also by the United States, by the other allies. How is this not picked up? And it's raised questions about security on a whole host of fronts as people look toward potential escalation. Will Israel come out and blame Iran directly? And what does that mean for the geopolitics of an already fraught region?
Well, yeah, and buried in the news flow this weekend is the idea of what does Israel do as a direct confrontation with Iran. And they certainly have the capabilities to do that, but it's in the category now, John, unimaginable is how I would put that, and yet people are trying to put a probability on that.
In the immediate aftermath, we were thinking about a full ground invasion. Tom, now you're starting to ask the question, I think over the last 24 hours, whether hostages, the scores of hostages that Hamas has taken, complicates that effort.
It complicates it immensely, and it's an international. Steve Strauss just had out on Twitter, I believe it's 10, I'm guessing folks from Nepal, who have been taken in some form of hostage. So it's a multinational hostage set. But I would go back to our initial insight in the 6 o'clock hour, which is the geography of this. You got 2 million people crammed into an area that is 2 times the size of Washington, D.C. I think that's something we can grab on. This is not urban warfare. It's highly congested territory that Israel's talking about, quote unquote, taking.
One of the most densely populated parts of the world on the planet, Tom. Let's turn to the price action. Give you a snapshot of how the market's responding to some of this. In the equity market at the moment, we're negative by 0.6% on the S&P 500. Futures pulling back. The bond market, the Treasury market, is closed today. So we'll turn to the German bond market just to show yields coming in just a touch by a basis point at 287. All eyes are on crude. As soon as that market opened up, it's a move of about 4% on WTI, Lisa. Let's call it $86 on WTI, and Brent crude right now close to 88.
And John, you said earlier, it's kind of amazing to think that we thought that we would come in and talk about payrolls and how much has changed over the weekend. Some of the details of this week are getting de-emphasized in favor of what you're talking about, people just scouring the headlines. Today, though, for those who are following the sort of normal role of economic information, Fed Speak includes Dallas Fed President Lori Logan, Fed Vice Chair Philip Jefferson, Fed Vice Chair for Supervision Michael Barr. Then today, we do have the kickoff of the World Bank IMF annual meetings in Marrakesh. They do go through Sunday. A curious question around how they may weigh in on this, where they may provide aid, and this comes after Christine Lagarde came out and noted that the IMF has cut its global growth forecasts, the one that they're going to release tomorrow. And meanwhile, there is yet another deadline for some of the auto worker strikes, 11:59 p.m. today, this time in Canada against General Motors, basically trying to get some sort of agreement similar to the one that they got from Ford. There's also some sort of strike at a Volvo Mack Trucks factory in the United States by the UAW. You can see GM shares lower by 1.3%. John.
Lisa, thank you. Our top story this morning, the Israel-Hamas conflict entering its third day with over 1,100 dead. Israeli forces responding with strikes in Gaza after the militant group entered Israel, taking hostages over the weekend. The Wall Street Journal reporting Iranian security officials helped plan what would be the biggest Israeli security failure in decades. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken maintaining they have not seen evidence to confirm the cooperation.
There's a long relationship between Iran and Hamas. In fact, Hamas wouldn't be Hamas without the support that it's gotten over many years from Iran. We haven't yet seen direct evidence that Iran was behind this particular attack or involved, but the support over many years is clear.
Joining us now is Bloomberg's Anne-Marie, our chief Washington correspondent. MH, good to see you. How that point there evolves, that very specific point about Iran's direct involvement, does that hold the keys to how this escalates and whether this turns into a broader regional conflict?
That's one of the main points. But remember, Iran has a number of groups in the region, proxy groups that it backs. It's not just Hamas, it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, it's the Houthis as well. But direct confrontation with Iran, say Israel were to attack, if these reports from the Wall Street Journal were to be true, that would stem a much wider regional conflict. We should note, I've talked to a lot of people over the weekend, and I've yet had anyone on the phone say to me, or in person say to me, that Iran was directly involved. Of course, we all know for years Iran has backed and supported and funded Hamas, but directly involved, a lot of people have thrown a lot of cold water to me on that fine point.
What a difference a week makes. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan just last week. The Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades. How did they miss this? How did we miss this?
Huge intelligence failure, I would say more so on the Israeli side. They have supposedly informants in Gaza. They have this huge border security wall in Gaza. This is a group that they have infiltrated, and to Norman Roll's point in your 6 o'clock hour, they were obviously, what Hamas was doing was using something that was really outside of the normal structure to make sure they could, in fact, execute on this attack. It is a huge security failure. That's going to be looked at secondary at the moment. What Israel's doing right now is they are mobilizing 300,000 Israeli soldiers. That's what the Jerusalem Post says. This is the biggest conscription they have ever seen, and they were announcing that this morning. So what leads to next is likely potentially a ground invasion, something we've not seen in decades in Gaza, and the broader implications are really going to be paramount. I think when people say this is a 9/11 moment, not just for the shock and awe of what happened on the ground in Israel, but the fact that this is now going to spread, this can affect everything, including next year's presidential election.
Yeah, look, Mary, you and I talked about this over the weekend, and we're all getting up to speed, and particularly of a certain vintage. Palestine is Yasser Arafat. He died in 2004. How do you identify, or more importantly, how does President Biden identify whom to speak to that represents Palestine?
Well, Hamas is not the Palestinian Authority. It's very different. Hamas owns the Gaza Strip. This is different than, say, the West Bank. What the Biden administration will likely do is put a lot of pressure on, say, Saudi Arabia, on Qatar, on Turkey. These are the groups that have direct lines of communication and house, as well, officials from Hamas. That is going to be how they likely are going to be able to extract hostages. And the hostages at this point, could be from a number of countries. These are not just Israelis. Over the weekend, you heard U.S. officials talk about likely Americans are part of that hostage. Norman Rowell talked about he thought a Thai individual was there, a Chinese national was potentially there. So there's also could be potential international pressure coming from around the world when a hostage is taken in Hamas, somewhere hiding in Gaza, likely in a tunnel. It is not just going to be Washington, D.C. that's going to exert that pressure.
You said that this may affect the presidential election. We've got a long way to go before we get there. And there's a question about how the hands of the U.S. and potential aid will be tied by the fact that we don't have a House Speaker. As John mentioned, we don't have an ambassador to Israel. We don't have a whole number of key positions that have been filled already preparing for this. How much does that really interfere with the U.S.'s ability to respond?
So on the ground in Israel, and the former Israeli ambassador was on CNN yesterday, Tom Nides, and he was talking about their charge d'affaires doing an excellent job. We have a very big posting in Israel. These are people who have been doing this job for years. And a lot of work that gets done with the Middle East happens actually in Washington, D.C. It's the Saudi ambassador, it's the Qatari ambassador that have direct dialogue with the White House. When it comes to what's happening with the House at the moment, there is no speaker. And what you hear from Patrick McHenry, who's the interim speaker, is that the only thing he can bring to the floor is a speaker vote. He cannot bring legislation. But Tony Blinken yesterday put a little bit of cold water on the fact that they wouldn't be able to send Israel the goods they need. We already know that they're sending warships, but also there was a memorandum signed under the Obama administration that every year there'd be $3.8 billion of security assistance sent to Israel. That likely, that's something they can use and draw from. But yes, it does create a bit of paralysis, and obviously dysfunction in Washington doesn't help when there's national security concerns.
One thing that I do want to get your view on, just before we even get to that presidential debate and what the political implications are in the U.S., is how to understand some of the statements coming out of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the like. They've all been critical of Israel, saying that Israel created the situation, and yet there still is this feeling from Israel that the Saudi Arabia deal is still on the table. Do you have any insight in how to understand the position of some of the nations like Saudi Arabia, like Egypt, like Qatar?
I think what we need to do is look at what they're doing optically in terms of press releases. They will continuously stand by Palestinian people. They all have a domestic audience as well. At the same time, you should look at who their phone calls, what they're doing in terms of their phone calls. I believe there's a number of phone calls, at least one or two, between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Saudi counterpart over the weekend. The diplomacy will be happening behind the scenes. It will not be in the press statements when you see these Arab countries. And yes, obviously, normalization talks are going to hit a massive pause from this, but I don't think they're done. I don't think normalization talks are done forever. The big issue, of course, was part of the normalization talks, and Mohammed bin Salman said this to Bret Baier in that Fox News interview, he actually didn't, I mean, they continually call for a Palestinian state, but what he said was about the life of Palestinians. There would have to be repercussions, or the Saudis would have to give, the Israelis would have to give concessions to Palestinian individuals for them to have a better life. How do you do that when there is a state of war between Gaza and Israel?
It's unthinkable that Israel will now provide concessions, given the events over the weekend, surely.
At this moment, yes. But also you have to look, Gaza is also different from, potential dialogue and diplomacy with the West Bank.
AMH, stay close. Stay close. If you are just joining us, welcome to the programme. I want to turn to the price action just briefly. A quick look on what's happening in the commodity market. Crude up by 3.8%, 85.93 on WTI. Brent crude rallying as well. Equities just a little lower. On the S&P 500, negative here by 0.6%. AMH, we've talked a lot this morning about the lack of a speaker, the lack of an ambassador in Israel, Lebanon, Egypt. The list goes on and on and on. We've touched a little bit on Schumer as well, the Senate Majority Leader being over in China, disappointed with Xi Jinping's response to all of this. Where is China in all of this?
They put out a statement that just talked about this conflict basically in the realm of the bigger toxic hostilities you have seen between Palestinians and Israel. Didn't actually come out and condemn the massacre of Israelis and others that we saw over the weekend. So Xi Jinping had this meeting with these bipartisan senators, and because of what happened over the weekend, this became a top priority for Schumer and what he wanted to discuss in the dialogue. This was supposed to be a meeting about a ton of other issues, but then it became about this conflict.
How do we project into the region? The phrase I've used this morning is we have to staff up. What are you going to see from the Biden administration in the next 2 days?
Potentially, Secretary of State Antony Blinken will have some sort of trip to the region.
Show of diplomacy.
Show of diplomacy. We're sending warships as well. There will be a huge show of military force. This will not go unnoticed in the region.
AMH, thank you. Anne-Marie on the latest, our chief Washington correspondent. Coming up later on this hour, we'll catch up with Ellen Wald of the Atlantic Council on the politics of the Middle East and the reaction, Tom, in the crude market.
Absolutely perfect. This is going to be an important interview on petroleum here, up a couple dollars, $88 a barrel on Brent.
Brent crude up 3.5%, WTI up 3.7%. Live from New York, this is Bloomberg.
not selling the Patriots, you're not selling the packaging company. I guess you don't like to sell things, right?
I really don't. We try to create a family environment in everything we're involved in. People want to be part of something that's bigger than themselves.
From New York City,
From London, in Sydney,
from Washington,
in Tokyo.
9 a.m. in Beijing and Shanghai.
Good morning, everyone.
Have a great evening. Here's what I'm watching.
You do not want to miss this
Is
story.
there the kind of upside?
The ongoing events in Israel over the past few days are horrific. I urge you and the Chinese people to stand with the Israeli people and condemn these cowardly and vicious attacks. I was very disappointed, to be honest, by the foreign ministry statement that showed no sympathy or support for Israel during these tough, troubled times.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer speaking in Beijing ahead of today's meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, expressing his disappointment and criticizing China over the foreign minister's statement showing no sympathy, in his words, or support for the Israeli people during these tragedies. More on that in just a moment. Here's the price action. The equity market moving lower on the S&P 500, negative 0.6% on the S&P. Yields totally unchanged in Germany. There was a bit of a haven demand story, money flowing into the perceived safety of bonds in places like Germany. The Treasury market, of course, closed today. 2.88 is the yield on a German 10-year. The crude rally continues, Tom. WTI up by 3.7%. Similar move on Brent. WTI crude just south of $86.
With U.S. bond market close, I'd also say the haven of Swiss franc speaks volumes. These are little four-digit ticks, John. I don't want to oversell it, but certainly Swiss franc confirms attention this morning.
Bracing for what's next.
Yeah.
Seems to be the stance this morning.
What is next? And the answer is, to me, it's the sun and the night, and it's day 3 of a war. And, it's a little bit like February of 2 years ago in Ukraine.
A targeted response, a broader regional conflict, a full ground invasion.
As Lisa says, the geography's, the optionality's just off the chart.
We don't know.
We'll have to see. Futures, negative 28. Right now on the markets, Amy Silverman joins us, head of derivatives, RBC Capital Markets here this morning. How does the bond debacle, I've got on real Bloomberg Total Return Index, I got a 10 standard deviation move. Whatever it is, the number doesn't matter. The answer is you've got to deal with this strange mathematical word, magnitude. How does the magnitude of the move change your equity calculus?
Good morning. I've been thinking about that all weekend. Look, when we came into this weekend, the tails in the market, the standard deviation of skew in the market was quite low. And that's been true for the last few years outside of the regional bank crisis. And obviously that's going to change. I would say that options markets are notoriously bad at pricing geopolitical risk. We've seen that time and time again, but the first thing it tends to do is overreact. So I do think you see that spike in volatility, but what I will tell you is we've seen big tech act as a safe haven. If that does happen, that's going to start muting your volatility again, because that's actually what we did see February 2 years ago, and I'd be curious to see if that follows through this time around.
Percolating in the zeitgeist this morning of Wall Street quant research is the idea that if you have higher yields, it solves its problem, and yields come in because higher yields beget that kind of move. Do you buy it for a minute?
So it's interesting. The way we've been monitoring it is through TLT, so the 20-year proxy of the ETF, and that put skew is extremely high. I'll tell you 2 nuances to it, Tom. The first is all the rate sensitivity ETFs, like your XLU, like your consumers, those have dropped in skew outside of this weekend, but that never happened in TLT. So essentially what it's telling you is that nervousness, that demand for downside in TLT, which we're using as a proxy, has not changed, even with the moves we saw last week.
As we talk, there are a whole host of unknowns people waking up to, are looking at every headline and trying to understand whether this will broaden into a wider regional conflict that could cause oil prices to spike and generally cause some sort of stagflationary cycle that people are hearkening back to the 1970s with. How much can you see a positioning shift preparing for this? I mean, I'm curious from your vantage point how that's even traded or imagined, or whether people aren't even going there.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think 2 things. I think it's helpful today that the bond markets are actually closed, because essentially what you're going to see is the equity in a vacuum response. So we'll see what happens with energy. We'll see what happens with the rate-sensitive ETFs, but we actually won't get the response until Tuesday from rates itself. I think what you're going to get positioning-wise is people who have done well this year, who've participated starting from that NVIDIA blowout earnings, saying, you know, perhaps now there is a reason to hedge, because we're not just talking about this kind of orderly sell of possibility from higher rates. We're actually talking about tail events, those unknown unknowns that were not priced into the market prior to this.
Are you getting a lot of calls from people trying to understand how to view this through a lens of protection? Are you getting a lot of sense that investors are watching this with nervousness?
Yeah, yes, and I think I will continue to, because what you've seen so far this year is hedging has been very stratified. You haven't seen it on the broad market level. You haven't seen it on S&P. You haven't really seen it on VIX or IWM. You've seen it in just the utility space or just the home builder space, just Canada. But what I think we'll see is the question of, does it make sense to have a broad-based hedge right now, given these geopolitical risks? Everything that's going on, implications to China, implications to Iran, those tend to be these knife-down scenarios that are your first gut reaction in the market.
What do the derivative space say about the chosen seven? Let's pick on Apple here. We've got JP Morgan coming out here on Friday, but I'm fascinated what the derivative dynamics are of massive free cash flow, massive cash on the balance sheet techs.
They're pretty sanguine, and that's been the thing, Tom.
Why?
That, it's just, you've seen...
She doesn't care about the why. She just looks at the math. That's all there is to it.
I can tell you the math is telling you it's sanguine. Now, the why, I think because, one thing clients have said to me is, look, we talk about them as long duration instruments, but they don't have to be, right? They can choose to buy back stock if they want. They could choose to change that cash flow. So it's not necessarily the same as an XLU where they are just more duration sensitive. There is this ability to change that in mega cap tech, which gives them slightly more optionality. And then, of course, you've had the safe haven status that's lasted the last few years. And as you continue to see that, that continues to be reflected in option sentiment.
Where is positioning when it comes to energy, especially in light of some of the rally that we're seeing today and some of the discussions around some sort of continued price spike in the wake of potential sanctions and other types of production, potential disruptions?
Yeah, so what I'll tell you is a lot of those hedges that you've seen have rolled off, but that was prior to this weekend. What I think we start seeing beginning today is reinitiation. So folks are going to sit here and they're going to say, okay, what are the geopolitics coming forward? Of course for energy, but obviously for the rates spectrum as well. And I think you're going to see reinitiation of a lot of hedges, which keeps that volatility bid.
Amy, thank you. Amy Wu Silverman there of RBC Capital Markets. Your latest update this morning, this coming from AFP, quoting the Israeli defense minister ordering a complete siege on the Gaza Strip, saying this is a quote, Tom, "We're putting a complete siege on Gaza, no electricity, no food, no water, no gas. It's all closed." That quote, according to AFP, coming from the Israeli defense minister.
So, and again, some would say it's been all closed for decades and decades, but the answer is the geography here is extraordinary. On the narrow strip, again, 2 times the size of Washington, D.C., all the way down to the Egyptian border. I'm fascinated with the Egyptian response that will be. But the geography speaks volumes here, John, and I can't, I'm going to listen to Mark Kimmett, Ben Hodges, Stavridis of the United States Navy, those kind of people I'm going to listen to.
There's a couple of things we're listening for, Tom, whether Iran is directly implicated and whether this leads to a full grand invasion of Gaza. There was a strong hint it might when we heard over the weekend from Israel's ambassador to the UN that every inch of Gaza has become part of Hamas's war machine, at least avowing that his country, Israel, would obliterate all of the group's terror infrastructure. Based on the people we've already spoken to this morning, that is severely complicated by the scores of hostages that Hamas took over the weekend.
Some reports saying they number more than 150, and they are international hostages. I believe that Israel confirmed this morning that some of them are U.S. citizens. There is a question of how that complicates broad attacks, but it seems to not have precluded some sort of broad severing of a lot of the basic resources to the region. And, we are dealing with a situation where I believe it's 2.3 million people live there, and trying to weed out the Hamas versus the civilians is going to be very tough.
Tremendously difficult. That's the latest from the Israeli Defense Minister, according to AFP. Coming up in the next hour, plenty of guests lined up to discuss this throughout the morning on Bloomberg TV and radio. Ron Dermer, the Minister of Strategic Affairs for Israel, will be joining us at 8:15 Eastern Time. Later on this hour, on the oil market, on Saudi Arabia, Ellen Waldtom, Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council and author of Saudi Inc.
Yeah, exactly. Author of the royal family of Saudi and how they will respond to this, not only with Israel, but with the United States.
Tom, that's the latest. Much more still ahead. Live from New York City this morning. Good morning to you all. Your equity market is lower. Your oil market is rallying. 85.70. Crude up by 3.5%.
London will stay a financial center. It will stay our EMEA hub. We'll just have a rebalancing onto the continent. And actually, the numbers of who has moved across aren't that big. So it's sort of in the 200 level. And if you think about 15,000 people, that's sort of not that material. And so I do think both will basically continue to grow and continue to be very relevant. What will change, though, and the big thing that's changing, is actually the risk-taking is what's going to move. And so we've historically had risk-taking in the UK. That risk-taking and the assets that go with it, not the people alone, but the assets that go with it, that's the next phase of what we're now moving into. And that will be a material change.
CFOs are reshaping the C-suite. Bloomberg's chief future officer shines a spotlight on these dynamic leaders. ON's running shoes have a unique look, and so does its leadership team. CFO Martin Hoffman is also co-CEO, and he thinks two jobs are better than one.
How do you balance those two roles?
I feel the CFO makes you a better CEO, and the CEO makes you a better CFO.
Watch Chief Future Officer this Wednesday on Bloomberg.
Live from New York City, here's your equity market on the S&P 500, negative, pulling back down by 0.6%, following a decent week of gains on the S&P. Best week of gains going back to early September on the NASDAQ. Second week of gains, the NASDAQ last week, up 1.75%. Down this morning, but up last week, even with a major move in the bond market. 2-year, 10-year, 30-year German Bund looks like this. Yields this morning, just a little bit lower by a single basis point on a 10-year in Germany, 287. The Treasury market is closed after a week where we saw the 10-year climb by more than 20 basis points last week for a 5th straight weekly gain. The 30-year yield higher by more than 26 basis points. Tom, on a 30-year in America last week.
I'd say the zeitgeist over the weekend, and we'll pick it up tomorrow with a lot of data. I'd really pick it up in Asia tonight. Is the idea of, there's a lot of debt out there. Ed Yardeni was very, very good about that, just saying there's just way too much debt. And that's an overlay that, I'm guilty of not talking enough about because we're so worried on surveillance about, hey, I slept, what happened overnight? That seems to be the theme, but there's just a ton of debt out there.
Waking up this morning,
very scientific.
What do you see? Thanks for that, Tom.
Thank you, I nailed it.
Dollar stronger, euro weaker. The euro against the dollar looking like this. We're negative by 0.5%, 105.37. Under surveillance this morning, the death toll from the conflict between Israel and the militant group Hamas topping 1,100, with fighting continuing into a third day. The Wall Street Journal reporting Iran helped plot the attack on Israel, Iran denying the report, while U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told CNN they haven't seen any evidence of Tehran's involvement. There's a big focus on the dysfunction in Washington, D.C. this morning. We have no speaker in the House. We have no ambassador to Israel, to Egypt, to Lebanon. The latest on that front, Lisa, you noticed this one from Punchbowl News. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee will soon notify members that Jack Lew's confirmation hearing to be U.S. ambassador to Israel will be scheduled for Wednesday, October 18th.
There is a feeling that things are accelerating right now as people try to set up for something that could become a prolonged and protracted conflict. This is something the Israeli government's been saying, that they also are expecting something that is going to take a long time, also shutting down a natural gas production plant operated by Chevron as they try to protect their population in Israel. So it does feel like this is a multi-front war, and it is happening in a sense that people are going to be experiencing it for quite a while.
Things were quiet, so we were told.
Right.
The National Security Advisor to the President, Jake Sullivan, only a week ago, hasn't been this quiet in decades. Tom, it's not quiet anymore. And now there's a sense of urgency that you get in Washington that wasn't there before.
It's a new sense of urgency as you staff up. I'm so glad you brought up Jack Lew, who's been a wonderful friend of the show for years. Jack, if Jack Lew can't get bipartisan support, John, we just basically ought to give it up. He's a Democrat out of Massachusetts. He'd take offense that I said that. He's out of the Kennedy-Joe Moakley combine. But this is a guy who has massive bipartisan cred. And, John, to me, it's literally a litmus test of a dysfunctional Washington.
You'd have to imagine he will get that confirmation after the events of the weekend. I want to get to the business reaction to some of this. A growing number of airlines suspending flights to Israel, with Delta, United, American, all cancelling flights to Tel Aviv. Lisa, as did some European airlines too. U.S. authorities advising carriers to monitor the situation before resuming operations.
Yeah, I believe Lufthansa was also one of those canceling them. Not canceling was El Al and a host of others, as a number of Israeli-born people living in other places were coming back to be conscripted into the army, as they called up, 300,000?
300,000 according to the IDF.
300,000 troops, yeah, that's this morning. They're saying they want that kind of force to be prepared to have some sort of offensive in the days to come.
The airlines might have to deal with higher energy prices as well. Crude rising this morning as the conflict in Israel could affect the wider Middle East, home to almost a third of global oil supply. Crude coming off its biggest weekly loss since March, but retracing some of those losses since the conflict began. We touched on this going into the weekend. Lisa, the headline of the Wall Street Journal, the front page, was about whether the Saudis would increase oil output into next year off the back of a potential pact between them and Israel. And now we are waking up this Monday morning basically suggesting that is on ice for now and maybe a long time.
And some analysts suggesting it's not unrelated, right? That this might have been one of the motivations for the attack, because geopolitically there were some regions, in particular Iran, that did not want to see this agreement come to the fore, which raises a question longer term about what kind of retaliatory actions there will be, not only against Iran, but with respect to sanctions by the U.S. on Iran, which is part of the reason why Halima Croft of RBC, you were mentioning her report over the weekend, talking about how that could be one of the initial potential reasons for a pop in energy prices.
Well, AMH suggested, what, in the last 20 minutes or so, part of that potential pact, Tom, was Saudi Arabia demanding concessions from Israel for the Palestinian people. Based on the events over the weekend, most people would suggest that's incredibly unlikely now.
The violence of the military right now of both sides is so great. I think the diplomacy is off. John, we need to do what Dr. Bremer was talking about this weekend. You mentioned 300,000 being called up in Israel. My mathiness on that is something below 10 million in the United States. I mean, we don't have scope and scale here. That's part of what we have to do here over the coming days as well. Right now, on the bond market, I guess, or on price down or what it's done, shattered your retirement account. Gennady Goldberg joins us, head of U.S. rate strategy at TD Securities. And it goes to a comment of Ed Yardeni of the Bond Vigilantes over the weekend, and that is, there is way too much debt. Cut to the chase. You guys nailed the curve inversion. TD Securities led on that. Is this the issue now? There's just too much debt?
Well, I think it's certainly become the issue. I mean, you're talking about higher oil prices. You've got other things, including much better than expected growth momentum over the last couple of years, a couple of months. And this debt issue is not going to go away, as you said. I mean, this is the overarching theme that we've been kind of talking about. Right. But no one's been paying attention to it for the last 15,
Including
20
me.
years.
I've been guilty of this.
I've been guilty as well.
Maya McGinnis was on this, the late Pete Peterson and the whole crew, but we're finally, okay, we're here. So how do our listeners and viewers adjust?
I think get ready for a test of higher interest rates. I mean, certainly the events in Israel are going to throw a little bit of a wrench into what we've been seeing for the last couple of weeks, and we'll see how this evolves, and hopefully the conflict certainly does die down rather than escalate. But if it continues to escalate, I mean, the big issue is you may actually see, certainly an increase in rates that could prove destabilizing for markets overall. I mean, we've been talking about a test of 5%. I think that's not out of the question yet. I don't think
far away right now.
No, not at all. And I think we can test a little bit higher. I mean, you look at how high we got just before the financial crisis, it's about 5.3% in tens. I certainly wouldn't be surprised to see us at least try to get through that level now.
Let's go through things with some purpose. So Steve Major of HSBC alluded to this, that typically supply doesn't matter in downturns. Supply matters in expansions. And he's basically suggesting, why would anyone want to take on additional duration for less yield in an expansion with the kind of data that we saw on Friday? The answer to that, based on the moves on Friday, is not many people want to do that, so yields up across the curve. I think the stress test we got this morning, and to some degree it's unfortunate the Treasury market is closed, is whether, when bad things happen, will we still buy Treasuries? Are we learning this morning that we will?
I think we will. I mean, certainly the Treasury market, I mean, you see the reaction in the dollar as well. It's still the risk-off asset. So it's not like that's going away anytime soon. But on a broader scale, I mean, if you're an asset manager, yes, you might be allocating a little bit more into U.S. Treasuries at this point because it's risk-off. On a bigger picture, you're still seeing strong growth, and you're seeing a lot of supply. And, should you be allocating, and should you be trying to catch that falling knife effectively, before you're certain about where this conflict goes next?
We're dealing with the potential for the U.S. to increase aid to both Ukraine and now to Israel at a time where there already are constrained finances, and I'm wondering how much that's going to increase the appetite to borrow more, even though rates are high and there is this concern about the deficit. How does that factor into your view of rates going higher?
I mean, it just biases us to the upside on the rate side, and that's why I think a test of 5%, maybe a little bit higher, is certainly possible in the short term. The big question for me is, what does that do to the economy as a whole? Right, government will certainly continue to borrow, and I don't think it's an issue. It's more of a, what price can you borrow at, rather than whether you can borrow an extra 50 or 100 billion. The big question for us is, what does that do to companies that also need to borrow in this market?
The sort of common thought recently has been that companies have adapted and adjusted, to Tom's point. What you've seen is either workouts with private credit, private debt funds, or else basically they've extended and pushed out their maturities so long that they are immune. When is that no longer the case? When do you start to see a potential for a risk that has not yet been priced in?
I think with every passing day that we've got higher interest rates, it continues to build. And the question I hear from companies, and I meet with quite a few of them on a weekly basis, is when are 10-year yields going back below 4%, right? That's the big question on everyone's minds, which tells me even though they may be immune, they may be immunized or whatnot, they're still really waiting for rates to go down because they've got financing needs and they're waiting, right? So when can they no longer wait? Is that early next year? Is it kind of in the middle of next year? The big question is when does that kind of, when do you get enough of that tick going where they're just forced to step in and borrow?
John, I failed. We've been doing so much reading in on this terrible war in Israel and the Gaza Strip. The bank rate 30-year on Friday, I missed it, 7.93%. That's a jump from 0.88 up to 0.93. That's untenable.
Who's paying it?
Somebody's out there that is forced to pay it. There's somebody out there selling into this, and that yield up is priced down. I mean, these are the knock-on effects here. What is agency paper? What does credit look like?
Cheap. And the issue is...
Wait, that's called price down. Right. That's pro talk for price down.
Right, exactly. Cheap. The problem is what makes it richen, right? What's the catalyst? Is it a weakening in the economic data? And we haven't really seen it yet. It hasn't actually happened as quickly as economists have forecasted, and certainly guilty of that as well. But if the data weakens, certainly the buyers will step in. But the buyers right now are waiting on the sidelines saying, why would we catch this particular knife?
Barclays made the point going into the weekend last week that if the equity market crashes, then the buyers will come back into the treasury market. But Friday was an odd one because bonds went down, yields surged in a fairly intuitive way following a blowout payrolls report, and then equities rallied.
Right.
What did you make of that, just sitting at a bond desk?
Sitting there just scratching my head, to be entirely honest. I mean, I think there was a lot of repositioning on Friday. You even saw the reaction in yields as well. Yields went sharply higher, then retraced a very large chunk of their move.
Was that something technical?
I think there was a lot of short covering at that point. I think that was people taking off a lot of their short fixed income positions, maybe a little bit cleaner, so we'll see how it goes into next week. We've got a lot of event risk, between the FOMC speakers and the CPI report. I think people were taking some chips off the table.
We have not even, folks, this is how crazy this morning is with the horror that we're seeing in this war. John, I don't believe we've mentioned there's some inflation data later this week.
Yeah, Thursday, I believe. PPI data as well.
Which is arguably more important than this stunning jobs report we saw on Friday.
Several months ago, we were talking about the potential for the whole curve to drop to 3, 2s out to 30s, and now we're having a conversation about the whole curve coming up to 5 just a couple of months later. That is a major change. If you're just joining us, welcome to the program. Your S&P 500 is negative here. We're down by 0.6%. Kennedy, looking ahead to CPI, what are you and the team looking for later this week?
We're looking for a little deceleration overall. I mean, if you're looking at year-ago rates, they'll continue to slow. The big question over the next couple of months has to be oil. That's really the big unknown in our minds. I think if you're looking at it from the perspective of the Fed, they're still looking at a lot of the core components actually slowing down. So that's good news for them. The big question for them is going to be, what does headline inflation do? And what's that pass-through from some of the oil pressures into core inflation as well? We know that's not zero.
Did we start to hit demand resistance with gasoline prices in the last week? Do you trust that data?
That's a little bit of a tough one. Americans are still going to drive, and it's a question of what is really the breaking point for, how high do prices actually have to go for folks to actually really start to cut? I can tell you, I was out on the road this weekend. It didn't feel like anyone was stopping driving, at least from these higher gas prices.
You hitting the traffic?
Oh, yeah.
Traffic in Manhattan, just brutal over the last...
Every year it gets worse.
I know.
Every year.
I know. Kennedy, thank you. Thank you, sir. Kennedy Goldberg there of TD Securities. Coming up next, Ellen Wald of the Atlantic Council joining us after the tragic, horrific events over the weekend. And the horror, Lisa, it continues based on some of the brutal imagery that we're seeing over the last few days.
I really am curious to hear from Ellen Wald, given her Saudi Inc. Book and her studies in this region, to understand what the response is and what the potential for an ongoing deal could be at a time of such conflict.
Brent crude just north of 87.30 on Brent. On WTI, higher by 3.3% to 85.50. Ellen Wald of the Atlantic Council up next.
Steve's ability on the course may not be etched into any record books, but following him around, it's clear that it's not for lack of trying.
Jeez.
We were constantly hustling behind him as he caught up with executives in the portfolio companies and reminisced with former and current players.
He's a day trader. He caught himself, self-made day trader.
Yeah.
And so he's on the bus after a game in New England, and he's day trading on the bus, and Bill Belichick sees him and cuts him on the spot.
You know, in many ways, it's a convention, right, of the people that I don't see maybe once a year. And so it's kind of all come together. My firm, our charity, our fundraising efforts, and then the friends that are around. My dad and my brother, it all happens right there as a confluence of all these parts of my life that have found its common center.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything. Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg?
That is a great question.
It's a great question.
Great question.
Great question.
That's a question I get all night.
Bloomberg, top experts, great questions.
When I spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu this morning, I told him the United States stands with the people of Israel in the face of these terrorist assaults. Israel has the right to defend itself and its people. Full stop. There's never justification for terrorist attacks.
The President of the United States over the weekend following the tragic events in Israel, the attacks that have led to a war breaking out between Israel and Hamas, that conflict entering day 3, the death toll topping 1,100. From New York this morning, good morning to you. Your equity market on the S&P 500 pulling back by 0.7%. Bonds are rallying. Over in Germany, yields are lower by a couple of basis points. The Treasury market is closed today. Your 10-year, German 10-year yield is 2.86. In the commodity market, a sell-off last week. The biggest weekly loss for crude going back to March. Crude pulling back by several percentage points, Tom, last week. 85.50 is where we are now on WTI, a bounce of 3% on both WTI crude and Brent.
The key global barometer, and again, John, this goes through the safety and ability to transmit not only the Persian Gulf, but also the Suez Canal. And that gets you over to the challenges of anyone at war in that region, and particularly Israel at war in that region, really going back to 1973. We forget in 73 that Israeli forces got within X miles of Damascus to the north, and they made it to the Suez Canal and over the Suez Canal in 73. That's a bit of history that I think people really are wide on. This all comes up to the geopolitics of the region. Expert on this and a good friend of Bloomberg's surveillance is Ellen Wald, Senior Fellow at Atlantic Council. Her book, Saudi Inc., is definitive on hydrocarbons. Ellen, thank you so much for joining this morning. Really timely to have you with us. How does Israel get its oil? Are they in some way oil independent?
They're not really oil independent. Israel actually does, or used to get quite a bit of oil from the Kurdistan region of Iraq. It was shipped out via the Ceyhan pipeline from the port of Ceyhan in Turkey to ports in Israel, to Haifa, and to other ports. I don't think Israel's particularly concerned about getting oil or making sure that they have enough oil at this point. Though one interesting point that has just come up is that Israel asked Chevron to shut down the operation of the Tamar gas field platform, which is out in the Mediterranean in the northern part of Israel. And to me, that says that either they think that there could potentially be some sort of terrorist attack on that platform, which potentially either from Iran or Hezbollah, which I would say definitely signals to me a widening of this highly regional conflict and something that actually could be a potential threat to oil markets, to gas markets, especially if you consider that, like you said, the Suez Canal is not all that far.
To take it to Saudi Arabia and your expertise there, which part of Palestine does Saudi Arabia, does the royal family support?
That's a great question, and they're definitely much more interested in the Palestinian Authority run parts, the West Bank, than they are with Hamas. Hamas and Saudi Arabia, they see Hamas as a very destabilizing element, especially the Saudi monarchy does not like terrorists. Terrorists are just as much a threat to them and to their stability as they are to other areas. So and what's interesting is that they keep pushing for this regional two-state solution, regional peace agreement. They have always said that their recognition of Israel depends upon a regional peace deal and two-state solution, which is one of the reasons why I think it hasn't really gone very far and we haven't seen very much, because that's not something that Israel or that the U.S. is really prepared to push for at this point. The question is, will they drop this in favor of getting a defense pact from Washington, as they've indicated? They haven't quite indicated that, but they definitely have indicated that that's a top priority for them, especially on the nuclear front. And so that says to me that maybe they're willing to negotiate a bit on that requirement.
Ellen, there was also talk going into the weekend that as part of this pact, the likelihood is that we would get crude output increased into next year. And as you look across the region now, where will Saudi Arabia stand on that particular point? And what could this mean for Iran production and those barrels of oil that find their way on international markets?
Exactly. And Iran has been selling more oil recently, not necessarily because they're evading sanctions anymore, because sanctions are not as tight as they were, but simply because Iran has been able to increase their production. And so they're selling more with prices up across the markets. Iran is able to get more money for its oil, even if it's still selling it at a discount, and even though it's got competition from Russian oil. So if Saudi Arabia puts out another 1 million barrels a day than they are right now, that would definitely threaten Iran's money-making scheme from oil, because it would send prices lower. Of course, there are lots of other things that could also send prices lower for Iran. So that's not the only issue here. I think it's compelling that Saudi Arabia sees that 1 million barrels a day as a bargaining chip with the United States. They're saying, hey, you're going into an election year that could be tough. We can put 1 million barrels a day back on the market and lower oil prices for you if you help us out, if you get us this defense pact before election season, before a new administration comes in and we have to start all over. So I think that's a very compelling chip that Saudi Arabia has thrown into the game here.
You talked about Iran selling more oil, and it comes at a time where there's talk of the potential for sanctions or additional punitive measures if Iran is deemed to have a more active role in the planning and the execution of this attack. From your vantage point, how realistic is that? What kind of influence could that have, not only on the price of crude, but just in general to the region and the geopolitics there?
That's a really good point. I think that any kind of tightening of sanctions is not really going to have much of an impact. It's purely, something that it's purely just hyperbole and rhetoric, because enforcing sanctions is a multi-year-long process. Now, if we were hearing talk of, say, a blockade against Iranian ships leaving the Persian Gulf, that would be a totally different story. So if the United States is willing to take its Navy and ensure that Iranian ships can't get out of the Persian Gulf to sell their oil, or that ships that have transferred Iranian oil to them and not maybe Iranian ships can't get out, that would be a huge shift away from the current policy, which is just let's try to enforce sanctions. It takes 3, 4, 5 years to do that, and that could definitely cause a major spreading of the geopolitical conflict, I would say if that happens, oil prices would go through the roof.
But Ellen, can you just say on a broader level then, do you think that any kind of interruption or disruption to oil production has been overstated, and particularly in the price of oil this morning? Or do you think that there is a broader implication as this goes on that you are watching?
I think that the $4 increase that we saw overnight was too much. We've had regional conflict between Israel and Gaza before, and oil prices jump a little and then they come back down because people realize there is no larger impact to oil producers. But in this case, we are really, I think, on the verge of a larger geopolitical regional conflict. There are so many other pieces here that it isn't that the jump in oil prices is basically anticipating that. It's anticipating that there could be some kind of disruption, and that's more likely in this case than it has been in the past.
We need to diagnose the sell-off as well last week too, Ellen. If we can finish there, I think it's important. Was that sell-off in anticipation of potential boost to crude output from Saudi, or was it because we saw evidence of our demand limits being tested by this price surge?
I think it's the second. It's definitely more of a larger demand issue that is coming to light or that is finally being realized in the market. I do think that the news that Saudi Arabia could increase production starting in 2024 if this, if they get what they want from Washington, could definitely be a catalyst. But that really didn't come out until Friday, and the sell-off had started before that. So I do think it's much more based on the demand issue.
That news was dated pretty quickly, let's put it that way. And a thank you and a world of the Atlantic Council on the latest. I've said this a few times, Tom. Front page of the weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal. Crude output, Saudi Arabia could be boosted off the back of an Israel pact with
changed.
Saudi, and everything's changed very quickly.
We heard it. We've each got our own story on this. And I would go back to 73 and 67 as a child, how I interpreted that. But I think it took me a couple hours to get to that emotion of, as the headline was, it's their 9/11. I'm not saying that. I'm saying I didn't get there right away. Neither did the Wall Street Journal or any other news organizations. The shock here was stunning.
$88 on Brent, very close to that level. On WTI, just through 86, running here by more than 4%. Coming up in the next hour, Ron Dermott, the Minister of Strategic Affairs for Israel, live from New York. This is Bloomberg.
A lot of the focus on the breakthroughs were because a lot of these research labs, the OpenAIs, Anthropics of the world, DeepMinds, had this focus on AGI, artificial general intelligence. Can you build an AI that can do anything?
Yes.
And it turns out maybe you can. So
making a machine that's in our own image, in a sense, that's what AGI sounds like.
More than that, it's a general intelligence. So it's the kid that made you look bad at school because he was good at everything. The top performer.
Right.
Like GPT-4 now can pass the bar exam, the medical licensing exam, the GRE. It's probably going to Stanford, next fall. But then our take was, that's great. You can have these amazing giant general models. What will be better is to mimic humanity, where our companies are not one generalist doing everything. What if we made it so you could bring your own data to the models and have lots of specialists working together and have those models working for you that you own?
Right.
These models like really talented graduates that occasionally went a bit weird. It's called hallucinations or other things. But that's because we feed them bad data. So we were like, what if you had open data, open models, and allowed it to be customized and specialized? So again, like a talented graduate, and they can learn very quickly from a few examples. So they have this base of generalized knowledge. They've been through kindergarten, high school, and university, but they're not specialized yet. But you can train them yourself, or you can just show them some examples, and they learn very quickly.
The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
I see a world where financial conditions have gotten tighter, and the transition mechanism, which the Fed would like to see in slowing down the economy, which we all expected, it's taken a lot longer. So the real impact of higher costs around the globe, in the US and Western Europe, it's not been felt yet. And so when people say, well, we're going to have a soft landing, I'm skeptical.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Obviously, we were trying to create shoes for me to wear in the Olympics, and that was happening pretty quickly. And then just understanding a new industry and how shoes are even made. But as we went down that path and started to just learn and research more, we learned that shoes have not been made for women. What that means is a shoe is made off of a last, which is a mold of the foot, and it's the mold of a man's foot used to make women's sneakers. And I think it took time for us to really grasp that because, you know, we've been in shoe stores and we've gone to the women's section and it's like, no, there are shoes for women. Like, what's this over here? And then to really understand, like, all of that is marketing. This is just a man's shoe, like in a different color. And so that kind of eye-opening experience was just like, okay, we got to do this. And even more than making the shoes, like, there's a deeper purpose here. Like, women deserve better and we shouldn't be an afterthought.
The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
The market is starting to look over the Fed's moves into falling interest rates.
We actually think that core inflation is going to fall a little faster than the Fed expects, and that will allow them to start cutting rates by March of next year.
You get a price spiral when labor markets are tight. In manufacturing, labor markets are still very tight right now in the US.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Today, the people of Israel are under attack, orchestrated by a terrorist organization, Hamas.
It's incomprehensible, and we're still waking up and hoping it's a nightmare.
This is Israel's 9/11, and Israel will do everything to bring our sons and daughters back home.
We chose the peaceful path to achieve our rights. But Israel continued using blunt force against Palestinian lives and Palestinian rights.
The United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Farrow, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Good morning, everyone. Jonathan Farrow, Lisa Abramowitz, and Tom Keene on radio and television, on economics, finance, investment, on international relation, and this morning on war. John Ian Bremer sums it up beautifully out on Twitter. This in the last 40 minutes. This from Dr. Bremer, the Israeli defense minister. I ordered a full siege on the Gaza Strip. No power, no food, no gas. Everything is closed. That upon 2 million people.
As they call up 300,000 people in Israel, according to the IDF, Tom, we're focused on two things: the potential for escalation abroad and the dysfunction at home. On the escalation abroad, the potential that Iran will be directly implicated by Israel and what that could mean for the potential of a broader regional conflict, and the dysfunction at home. We have no speaker in the House, no ambassador to Israel, to Egypt, to Lebanon, whether this will give Washington a sense of urgency to address some of these issues.
You know, to everyone, and particularly to the United States, with Anne-Marie Horton joining us here in a moment, John, it's about the idea of, well, these are normal times and we can have our domestic games, but the domestic games slip away given a legitimate war. There's no other way to put it.
Almost immediately, based on the reporting we've had from Punchbowl News this morning, Tom, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will soon notify members that Jack Lew's confirmation hearing to be U.S. ambassador to Israel will be scheduled for Wednesday, October 18th. So already you can see there's some action in Washington where there wasn't any at all in the last couple of months.
The former Secretary of Treasury there. Lisa, I love what you've done in your reading over the weekend about how this could expand beyond a strip of land between Egypt and Israel. Egypt used to be the protectorate of Gaza Strip until '67, I believe it was. And then it can move to the West Bank, off to the northeast, or it can move north up the Mediterranean to Lebanon.
There was some discussion about fortifying the area with Syria, but also with Lebanon, especially in light of Hezbollah. But here's the issue, right, is that right now this is really entering a fragile time for the Middle East. It comes at the time where we had been talking about a Saudi Arabian deal normalizing relations with Israel. This is not necessarily unrelated. And now there are questions of what does that do to that? How is Iran involved? And what role does the likes of Saudi Arabia and Qatar, like Anne-Marie actually just pointing out, have in trying to negotiate some sort of peace deal or hostage release type of agreement that could move this forward in a more benign way than what we see unfolding?
I question where that stands now after some of the images we're seeing and some of the counts. I look, Lisa, to your good thoughts here about some form of dialogue, but you just wonder of the violence to come before there is dialogue.
In conversations we've had so far, there are a lot of questions around where the intelligence breaches happen, not only in Israel, but also in the U.S., what the response will be like, and how far this will percolate, which is the reason why there's nervousness. You could feel that this morning, Tom, in the tape.
The bond market closed today. I believe it's Columbus Day, or at least that's what we used to call it, something like that, John. You know, there's like 4 names for the holiday. But the bond market closed today. But John, there is a bond proxy. I mentioned Swiss franc, and you mentioned German yields coming in.
German yields coming in is classic risk aversion, textbook stuff. Equity markets lower by 0.6% on the S&P 500. Bond market bid, slight rally, yields lower by a single basis point. Wouldn't make too much of that. Dollar stronger in the places you expect the dollar to be stronger in. A little bit of a weaker euro, stronger Japanese yen. But looking at crude, there's the move, up by 4% following the biggest weekly sell-off going back to March. WTI, Tom, 86. Brent crude just short of 88.
To all of you on radio and television, we've been trying to give you good conversation on this war. We had a gentleman with decades of CIA experience with us in a previous hour, and I'm thrilled to tell you that we'll have the former ambassador of Israel to the United States coming up here in a number of minutes. Anne-Marie Horton joins us now, our Bloomberg Washington correspondent. I still can't get used to the modern silliness that we don't have an ambassador to Israel. I get it, days and weeks after an inauguration. Well, this is juvenile.
Well, that nomination was announced from President Biden in September. They have yet to have a hearing yet. There's a number of steps that go into a nomination. But historically, if you look at how long, say, it took the Reagan administration versus the Trump administration, the Biden administration, the average to get things done in the Senate has grown exponentially larger.
I want all of our listeners and viewers are saying, AMH, why?
There's a number of issues. Sometimes it comes down to specifics on the individual. When you look at someone like Jack Lew, he has not yet gone through the Senate Foreign Relations confirmation hearing. That is the first step after they go through the FBI and the IRS investigation. An issue that can happen next, and there's some Republicans that have voiced concerns about an individual like Jack Lew because he worked in the Obama administration, and the Obama administration, of course, had the JCPOA with Iran. If there's any sort of lingering or confusion or concern that a Jack Lew ambassador may want to see better relationship with Iran, and is not going to be tougher on Iran, one single senator can have a hold. We're not there yet when it comes to Jack Lew, and Punchbowl is reporting that the hearing will happen October 18th. That is 2 days after the Senate actually comes back. So they are moving quickly on this, and he was only nominated in September. There's other issues, though. We've had people in limbo for months.
November 17th, we have a deadline. Government shutdown. Can you imagine a government shutdown with this happening abroad?
I can, only because at the moment we still don't even have a Speaker of the House. And there's not a lot of legislative days left in the calendar to get all of this done. And what you hear from interim Speaker Patrick McHenry is that the only thing he can do right now is bring a floor vote on a Speaker of the House. There's not much legislation that can get done. Potentially, what you're seeing happen internationally will provide a little bit more of an impetus for Republicans to act. House Republicans will be back in Washington, D.C., along with me this evening, 6 p.m., and they're going to have a dialogue and a discussion, as well as they will have tomorrow. And then Wednesday, they're supposed to have a vote within their conference. Can they rally behind these two individuals, potentially Jim Jordan, chair of the House Judiciary Committee? This is someone who's a staunch Trump ally. Trump is backing him. Or Steve Scalise. This is number 2 to McCarthy, potentially also McCarthy foe in some senses. There's a lot of reporting that McCarthy aides have been calling to whip for Jordan, but Scalise would be the obvious individual because he is number 2, but he's also dealing with some health concerns. But yet we're not sure just yet who can get to 217.
AMH, thank you. The latest from Anne-Marie. Tom, a real sense of urgency now in Washington to get a move on.
Well said, John. I think there's a sense of urgency, but I'm really not quite sure if the officials want to do that. Right now, joining us, Marta Norton, Chief Investment Officer at Morningstar Wealth, as you consider 2023 and what your 201k has done. Marta, Morningstar owns a high ground on the analysis of active versus index funds. Let me start with an update on how active management has done coming out of the pandemic.
You know, it's kind of an interesting story because when we look back on active and passive and the narratives around them, it's been this view that passive is ascendant and active is on its way out. And I think what's been really interesting that we've seen in the wake of the pandemic is that there's been more opportunities for active to add value. Now, I'm not saying that's been the case for all active managers, but this sense that a rising tide has lifted all ships and all you need to do is own your S&P 500 and your treasury bonds and you can call things a day. I think that view has at least been called into question to some degree. Now, we have our own investment strategies within Morningstar Wealth, and what we've seen is actually a real improvement of our performance over this period, and a lot of that has been because we haven't been in those traditional kind of big treasury stakes, big S&P 500 exposures.
There's a real test here, and this is something that we've been talking about, John raised earlier, about how bonds will factor into portfolios at a time of instability, especially given that this weekend, we saw that bonds were the source of such instability. How much will they act as a haven in this next cycle, whatever it may be, however the conflict that we saw really spring up over the weekend escalates?
You know, it's a really important question, and I think one of the things that comes to mind for me as we have taken a look at this tremendous shift in bond yields over this period is that there's been a lot of introspection. Can we expect the treasuries to behave as that safe haven status like they have in the past, especially at the long end? And I think what we would expect as we take a look at real geopolitical risk is that some of that introspection dies out in the near term, and there is kind of a shift to some of these areas. We see that with the dollar, of course, but then also when the treasury market opens, we could see some folks hiding for the protection there, even though there are these existential questions around debt levels, around deficits, and of course around higher for longer from the positioning of the Fed.
You own the high ground on flows. What are the flows in fixed income? I'm not talking about fancy surveillance talk about spread market duration and convexity. I'm talking about retirees scared stiff. What do you see in Chicago?
Well, I can tell you that from a flow perspective, we've actually seen still some dependence on long treasuries, more so than you would expect given performance. But what I will tell you from anecdotal conversations with financial advisors is there's enormous frustration and enormous disappointment. So I don't know if people have found that new linchpin for their portfolios, and maybe that's what flows are telling us. But I think psychologically, there certainly has been a bit of a pullback from what they can kind of depend on from the Treasury side of things.
Marta, thank you for your view this morning. Difficult morning to talk about markets, that's for sure. Yeah. Marta Norton there of Morningstar Wealth. If you are just joining us, equities are pulling back but slowly recovering. We're down about 0.5% on the S&P 500. In the commodity market, the rally picks up in crude. Tom high by more than 4% on WTI to 86, very close to 88. On Brent this morning.
And news driven here, and we're going to have to see. I just continue to follow singular headlines. What I'm going to say late afternoon to Israel, and you go into the night and you wonder what military response we're going to see from both sides here, and then how that affects oil going into the next morning.
Classic risk aversion. Equities lower. If you are just joining us, we're down here by 0.5%. Coming up very shortly, Ron Dermer, the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs, a conversation you do not want to miss. Tom, that conversation in about 5 minutes' time.
Former ambassador of Israel to the United States. This guy is the guy wired into the United States and Washington for Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. He is the guest this morning.
Especially someone who has insight into the agreement that was getting negotiated between Saudi Arabia and Israel and where that stands. There is a real question here about what happens now, where the pressures are, how isolated Iran is from the likes of Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, as they try to negotiate some sort of peace.
And just hearing this from the New York Stock Exchange, a moment of silence at 9:20 Eastern Time, a moment of silence that we will observe on Bloomberg TV and radio. The New York Stock Exchange extends its deepest sympathies to those killed and affected by the ongoing violence in Israel and Gaza. In remembrance of the lives lost and those still being impacted, we will hold a moment of silence at 9:20 Eastern Time. That's about an hour and 5 minutes away. Let's go through the broader price action at the moment. Equities pulling back. Bonds are rallying, yields are lower in Germany, treasury markets closed, dollar stronger in the places you'd expect the dollar to be stronger against the euro's back to 105.28, against the yen's showing a little bit of strength, so a bit of a haven trade there, still in the mix for the Japanese yen. And in the commodity market, there's your rally, up by 4%. Seemingly this comes back to Iran every single time, Lisa. Are they going to be directly implicated? Does this have the potential for a broader regional conflict? Does it take away the incentive to close that deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and ultimately take away the potential that we get a boost to output anytime soon?
Although Ellen Wald, just earlier, who wrote the book on Saudi Arabia, said that she doesn't really see any kind of sanctions materially impacting the amount of oil that Iran is putting out onto the market. So there are real questions here about where some of the disruptions will come.
Coming up next, Ron Dermer, the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs.
In global leadership are on Bloomberg.
The conflict between the U.S. and China has escalated so much. This is one of my greatest fears, that the small nation is forced to choose sides.
Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
The boundaries of the entertainment world are blurry, and they're all scrambling for the same thing, screen time. And navigating this multiverse is no simple task. At Bloomberg Screen Time, it's culture, business, converged. Bloomberg Screen Time, Naya Studios, Los Angeles, October 11th and 12th. Get your tickets at BloombergLive.com/screentime.
Markets countdown in Europe. From the financial centers of the world, Bloomberg Markets European Close with Guy Johnson in London and Alex Steele in New York. Real-time numbers, real-time analysis. Weekdays.
The challenge for Israel and the challenge for all who support Israel and oppose horrific acts of terrorism is, again, to take measures that provide for accountability for what's happened, and also to do our best to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And that is likely to take some time, and it's fraught with very difficult decisions for the Israelis to make.
We need to talk about those difficult decisions, Tom. That was Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, speaking on ABC.
Welcome all of you to Bloomberg Surveillance this morning, and this is an important conversation. Why? The duration. Ron Dermer is Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs, but far more, he was Ambassador of Israel to the United States for 7 years. His extended period in Washington, his work at Wharton, among others, is noted. And to have Ambassador Dermer with us, John, with his experience across all of a decade is important.
Minister, thank you for being with us this morning. And I think first and foremost, we have to extend our deepest sympathies to you and the people of Israel. Our first thoughts go to the hostages, the scores of hostages that were taken over the weekend. And as you know, there are some reports at the moment in the media that we'd love to get an on-the-record response from you on. This from Reuters a little bit early this morning, that Qatari mediators have held talks with Hamas officials to try to negotiate the release of Israeli women and children held in Gaza. Minister, are there active talks led by Qatar to release hostages?
Well, what I guess you just read to me is that Qataris were talking to Hamas about it. Israel's not been negotiating with anybody.
Has Qatar spoken to you about the release of hostages and their role they might play as a mediator?
as I said, what the Qataris speaking to Hamas and talking about different things. Look, people are outraged by what happened. I'm sure you're outraged. I appreciate the condolences. I know they're heartfelt and they're deeply appreciated. We haven't seen something like this, even in the Middle East, which, as you know, is has a lot of brutality and savagery in it. We haven't seen savagery like this since ISIS. When you have killers, scores of hundreds, really, of terrorists who invaded Israel on Saturday morning in trucks with AK-47s and just mowed down people who were at a dance festival, went into people's homes, killed whole families, kidnapped children, women, elderly. This thing is sick and it's savage, and you really have a battle between the forces of civilization on the one side and the forces of barbarism, and civilization is going to have to win. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the days ahead. And as you heard from Secretary Blinken, it may take some time, but we're going to exact such a high price that not only will Hamas never consider doing this again, I think none of Israel's enemies are going to ever think about doing something like this again. You know, the feeling of euphoria on the other side, Israelis, those of a certain age, remember 1973, when a surprise attack was launched against us on 2 different fronts. There was euphoria then for a few days, but then Israel turned the tide. And the end of the war looked very different than the beginning of the war, and this is exactly what's going to happen now.
Minister, based on what you've just told us, can we just assume then that a full ground invasion is inevitable?
We're going to do whatever we have to do to send a lesson that they're going to understand for many, many decades. Not just Hamas, not just the other terror organizations in Gaza, but all the terror organizations and all the enemies of Israel, and Iran is the biggest enemy of all, and they're pulling the strings behind the scenes, giving money, giving weapons, having meetings to try to coordinate attacks in Israel. And as I speak to you, Iran is trying to push other people into the theater of war. We're going to have to send a message to everybody, because Israel, you know, as you know, we're a tiny country. We're about the size of New Jersey. America's about 40 times the population that we have, which goes to show you how heinous the attack was yesterday. Because when you have maybe 1,000 people in Israel who were killed on a single day, and your population is 40 times the size, it's around 40,000 Americans. That's more than 10 9/11. So you can imagine the sense of disgust that we have. We have to send a message to all of Israel's enemies, because we're a strong country, but we're tiny, and we can go from strength to vulnerability. I think people are going to see the strength of Israel, the might of Israel, and I hope that the wall-to-wall support that we appreciate, that we have today from President Biden, the support on both sides of the aisle in Washington, I hope in the days ahead that support continues when Israel has to do what it has to do in order to exact such a heavy price from this terror organization that not only do they not threaten us, that they don't threaten any civilized country around the world. Believe me, this will inspire terrorists the world over, just like you had the ISIS caliphate that started inspiring people all around the globe. The world came together and understood they have to crush that caliphate. We have a force like that right in our backyard, not thousands of miles away, but right in our backyard, a few meters over the borders, and we're going to have to crush both their capability and also their spirit. They will rue the day 2 days ago. We're going to remember that day. Israel will always remember that day, but all the terror organizations around us are going to remember this period for a very long time, and the critical miscalculation that Hamas made, thinking that it was going to be business as usual in Israel. Believe me, it is not. The people are outraged, and they have awoken not a sleeping giant, but a sleeping Maccabee. And they're going to see it in the days and weeks ahead.
Minister, you mentioned Iran. Have you seen personally, or are you aware of, any evidence that Iran was directly responsible and helped coordinate these attacks over the weekend?
Well, let me tell you what we do know for sure. We know for sure that Iran provides the last numbers I saw, 93% of the military budget of Hamas is provided for by Iran. They are trying and have worked to put weapons, not just into Gaza, but also in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank. They also support Hezbollah, as you know, on our northern border. We know that as a fact. We know that Iran has coordinated meetings with all of its terrorist proxies in the region, Hamas in Gaza and another terror organization, Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, and Hezbollah, almost a kind of joint operations, I don't want to say joint operations center, but coordinated meetings. There was one question that I'm sure you're interested in. Did they know about this beforehand? Initially, we didn't think that they did. Now there is some evidence that they might have known about it. We are working to verify that evidence. That's why maybe there's some conflicting reports in the press that we don't exactly know. But now that we're looking back and we're looking at all of our intel and seeing exactly what the situation is, it's still not clear to us, but they might have done it. But I have to tell you, they are working right now to bring more and more terror groups into this fight. So everyone has to know it, and it's important not just, I think, to stand unequivocally with Israel against Hamas, to call for freeing the hostages, but also to stand unequivocally against Iran. You know, there's going to be the UN Security Council can tomorrow, Europe, France, Britain, Germany, they can work to snap bang the UN sanctions, the Security Council sanctions against Iran. You have to enforce oil sanctions against Iran. They're exporting a lot of oil. They're getting a lot of money, tens of billions of dollars. It's time that the world unites against Iran, because what you're seeing today is a tentacle of an Iranian octopus. And we have to not only cut off the tentacle, we have to deal with the regime that is sending them. And I hope that the world will stand with Israel, as I said, in the days and weeks ahead, to reverse this and turn it into a victory against terrorism and barbarism.
Minister, we have some news to work through on our side, and I'd love to continue this conversation with you at the same time. According to the CBS White House report, at least 9 Americans were killed in Israel. As I'm sure you know, this goes beyond the people of Israel. The whole world is looking at this moment. Just on Iran, you mentioned that you may have some evidence that implicates Iran directly for the operations that took place over the weekend. Could you share with us the nature of that evidence?
Unfortunately, I can't. If I could, I would, but I can't, and we're going to have to look through it. Now our working assumption is that they may have. Our working assumption a couple days ago was that they hadn't known about it directly. Now it is unclear, and we'll have to wait to verify it. And, you know, when we make an official statement, we'll make an official statement, but we have to work through that right now, because I want to make sure that when I say it, we know with 100% certainty. Now that is our working assumption.
We did hear this from the Wall Street Journal, that Iranian security officials helped plan Hamas's attacks and gave a green light for the assault at a meeting in Beirut last Monday, according to senior members of Hamas and Hezbollah. Are you aware of a meeting that took place in the last week between Iran and leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah?
They have meetings all the time. It's not secret. You can see pictures of them meeting with Iran leadership, the leadership of their Iranian Revolutionary Guard leadership, their Quds Force leadership, meeting with these other senior officials. So they've had many, many, many meetings over the last few months, and they work very hard. What is Iran trying to do? Those of your viewers who know the map of the Middle East know that Iran supports the Shia militias in Iraq. They're trying to establish a beachhead, a terrorist beachhead against Israel in Syria. They support Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is the northern part of Israel. They support both Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas in Gaza. Right. They support the Houthis in Yemen, and what they're trying to do is put a noose around Israel's neck with all of these terror groups there. And we have to make sure that we break out of that noose and deliver such a mighty blow that they're not going to forget it for generations.
Ambassador, I want to take your years of experience here, and it's outside your remit, but I'm sure it's something everyone wants to know. I can't get my head around how Israel invades the Gaza Strip. Do you anticipate substantial bombing and air attack, or are we ready for some definitive, original, building-to-building urban warfare in Gaza?
Well, because I'm a member of the Security Cabinet, I'm not going to discuss that. Let's just say we have a clear goal to cripple the capabilities of Hamas and also their will to wage war against us. So you're going to have to interpret that the way you want. I have to leave it at that. But it's people who doubt Israel's capabilities are making a huge mistake. We will do what we have to do in order to achieve that goal. And we are going to have to achieve this goal, obviously, first and foremost for Israel, but it's for all of our Arab partners in the region. Believe me, put aside all of those statements that are made by foreign ministries in the region, and some of you may have conversations with officials from the Middle East, and they may tell you a very different story about Israel than they may be saying publicly. There have been times in the past where Israel has fought with these terror organizations, and the ones who are rooting for us, usually first and foremost, are these Arab states who are threatened by these jihadi forces. Whether it's a Shia jihadi force or a Shia group like Iran and its proxies, or a Sunni group like Hamas, they don't want these forces of barbarism to win because they threaten them.
Ambassador,
and this is very just one thing, if I may. This is also very important for the pursuit of peace eventually. Right. Because no one is going to make peace with the weak. we have to be very strong, and it's strength that is actually going to improve our chances to reach an historic peace agreement with Saudi Arabia, which I have no doubt is one of the reasons why this action was taken at this time.
For our audience, Ambassador Dermer, can you triangulate the focus obviously on Gaza, but also now on the West Bank and a fractious northern border with Lebanon? How will Israel affect a three-front war?
Well, we have to ensure that our force structure is done in a certain way that we can deal with any threats that would materialize. And you say quite rightly, we have issues on the northern border. We had sirens there just about an hour ago. We had an attack there yesterday. There are different attempts for attacks. So we have to be clear on our northern border that we have all the capabilities we need to defend ourselves. As you know, the United States brought a carrier group into the Eastern Mediterranean. I think that sends a very strong message to deter our enemies, and it makes it clear that America backs Israel. And again, we're deeply appreciative of the Biden administration for doing that. I think it makes the chances of war less likely, not more likely. And of course, as you said, in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, we've had terror actions that have happened there, and we have an eye on that. We have to have our eye on a sort of a 360 radius in order to deal with all these different challenges. But I'll tell you, the chances of having a multi-front world grow when people see Israel as being vulnerable. So the stronger and faster we act, the more it will send a message of strength and purpose. And that message is critical to actually ultimately de-escalate the situation and prevent these things from happening for many, many decades. This is an attack, I want to say it again, the likes of which has never happened in the state of Israel. We may have lost 1,000 people in a single day. That has never happened in the state of Israel.
Ambassador, there's a big question around Saudi Arabia and the talks about normalizing relations. I know you've been involved with those, and it seems like those are at least iced in the near term. Saudi Arabia put out a statement saying that it repeated its warnings of the dangers of the explosion of the situation as a result of the continued occupation and deprivation of the Palestinian people of their legitimate rights. How much do you see this as really precluding additional discussions with Saudi Arabia and making this kind of normalization talk not viable in the near term?
Well, a lot of people were surprised by the Abraham Accords, a few years ago when no one thought that that could possibly happen. But Israel proved itself, its strength, frankly, its security strength, its economic vitality. I think that's what made those accords ultimately possible. I think the critical question of whether we're going to be able to achieve this historic peace with Saudi Arabia that pushes the whole Arab-Israeli conflict into a completely different place and can lead to a broader reconciliation between Muslims and Jews as well. The critical factor will be how Israel emerges from this fight. Or do we emerge as a victor? Because people make peace with winners. People make peace with the strong. They do not make peace with the weak. And that will be the critical factor. I'm telling you, take all the statements, all the diplomatic statements that have been made, put them aside. It's not relevant. I think there are many Arab partners in this region that want a different future, that are thinking about what's going to happen in 20, 30, 40 years down the road when oil doesn't have the value to their countries that it has today. They need a partner in Israel that can help strengthen their own national security, that can help their own national prosperity. You saw a few weeks ago at the G20 when several countries, the United States, European countries, India, launched this vision of an economic corridor that would go from India through the Arabian Peninsula into Israel and towards Europe. I mean, that's a game changer, an economic game changer for the region. And I think the Saudis have great plans for building their country. And believe me, there are a lot of people in a lot of places in the Middle East, no matter what they say publicly, are rooting for Israel to win. And I think they're going to get exactly what they want.
Minister, just to wrap things up, because I know you have to go, one final question. Winning. How do you define victory in a moment like this one?
Like I said, you have to cripple their capability, and you have to crush their will to do such an action for decades and decades to come. Not just Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but also other terror organizations in the region. We rely as a small country on our deterrence, but deterrence doesn't last forever. You have to exercise power and force to always make clear to your enemies that you're prepared to fight. Not only do you have the capability, but you have the will to fight. And our enemies, Hamas, obviously miscalculated here, because if they think that this action that they just took in murdering 1,000 Israelis and just shooting our civilians, and taking scores of people hostage and having over maybe 3,000 people who are wounded, that this is going to be business as usual. They just have no idea who the people of Israel are, and I think they're going to find out in the days ahead.
Minister, we appreciate your time this morning at a very difficult time for your commentary, and hopefully we can catch up again soon. Ron Dermer there, the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs. The conversation will continue on Bloomberg TV in the next hour. On the Open, Luke Hickmore of Aberdeen, Kristen Bidley of Citi, Henrietta Trays, Tom, to kick off the show of Vader Partners.
Great guest. It'd be wonderful to talk to Henrietta Trays, particularly about the openings that we've seen in Washington as well. And the markets, well, they've deteriorated ever so slightly is where I'm going to put it. The VIX 19.01, SPX down 27, Dow 165, NASDAQ down 0.8%. The bond market is closed today in the United States. We're seeing German yields come in to a lower yield, dollar stronger as you would expect, and I would note Swiss franc a little bit stronger as well. Lisa, Brent crude, I had an 88 print earlier, 87.75 on Brent crude.
The conversation that we just had there, again, do what we will do, just these hard words coming from Israel as they prepare to retaliate and as they prepare to send 300,000 troops that they have called up. It really raises questions about how this will evolve in the days to come, not only geopolitically, but also for markets.
Scheduled economics, finance, and investment, it slips by today, and particularly with the news flow we've seen in the last hour out of the greater Levant. And that, of course, stretches up to Turkey, Mr. Erdogan's Turkey, from Istanbul, and just one of our best bureaus worldwide. Owner Ant joins us this morning. Owner, Mr. Erdogan is a most interesting voice in this war. I go back to early Erdogan, where I was in Istanbul a lot, and maybe it was more parochial, more domestic, and there was a middle Erdogan where he thought he could be the voice for the region. And now we have this war. Mr. Erdogan has made comments. Where does his voice fit in assisting in this war?
He's been very much in the middle of the pack in the sense that President Erdogan has been neutral, just like his foreign ministry so far, calling on both sides and is fighting both Israel and the militant group Hamas to basically end the hostilities without further loss of civilian lives. A bit unexpected from Erdogan, but yeah, he's been largely kept mum, and when he did speak, he was very neutral. Unlike what you would expect from him in the past until recent years.
Although he did release a statement where he definitely was very critical of Israel, and there are some discussions that perhaps Turkey is housing some of the Hamas leaders that were involved in this attack. How much willingness is there on the part of Erdogan to work with certain nations to figure out where the leadership of Hamas is operating from and back Israel in any way?
Before Saturday's attacks, Turkey and Israel were in a process of normalizing their relationships. In fact, Netanyahu, after having to postpone his trip to Turkey over some domestic problems he was facing back in July, he was scheduled to visit Turkey and talk a bunch of issues, including energy collaboration with Erdogan, along with normalization of relationship between Turkey and Israel. As for Hamas, there has been no new statement from Ankara or the Turkish officials since Saturday's attacks, but we know that Hamas' presence in Istanbul has actually been downgraded massively over the last few months, and that was actually a precondition by Israel to start normalization process with Turkey. So we believe that if there are any Hamas officials left in Istanbul, the number of them is reduced in comparison to what was the case until a few months ago.
Owner, thank you so much. Owner, on too short a visit from Istanbul this morning as we look south to the Gaza Strip and Israel. We now turn to the economy. We'll continue to monitor the events that we see. Futures deteriorating, negative 29. Brent crude, perhaps an emotional marker, up $3. Rounded up 4%, 87.73. Neil Dutta has been a great voice on the resiliency of the American economy. We haven't even mentioned the jobs report for one moment in this distracted Monday, Neil. And the moment the numbers came out, well, I thought of Neil Dutta because it was a Neil Dutta kind of report. As you dug deeper into the data, did that jobs report show the optimism, the resiliency of the American economic experiment?
Well, absolutely. That was, I think that's the right word, Tom, resilience. You know, no jobs report is perfect. You know, so in this case, the household survey was a bit weaker than the establishment survey. But when you look at the trend in employment, I mean, this is a strong labor market. We're adding, you know, roughly 250,000 jobs a month on average over the last 3 months. The household survey is around 200,000 a month on average over that period. So, you know, that's fine. And I think it's consistent. I mean, certainly the doves on the FOMC are going to have plenty of ammunition to make the case that this is consistent with a soft landing. You know, the labor force is rising. Average hourly earnings, that's moderating. And so, you know, the activity numbers are holding up. That's proxied by solid jobs growth. So I think they have everything they need to make the case to skip in November. So, you know, the market, I think, is at 30% for a hike at the next FOMC meeting. You know, I would take the under. I think the doves are gonna win that battle, and I think that's probably going to be the case in December as well. So you're going to go into the new year with the Fed not having done a thing at the last 3 meetings.
Neil, we would have been talking about the headline figure and parsing through some of the jobs data and then looking ahead to Thursday's CPI report. Instead, we're talking about the potential for geopolitical violence, geopolitical tensions just spewing up in the Middle East. At this point, how much are you factoring in higher oil prices and what that would do to a situation where we are seeing growth, but that it's fragile around the edges?
Well, I don't know that growth is as fragile as people are making it out to be. You know, if anything, what's been fragile is the consensus forecasts of growth, because those have been getting revised up repeatedly. What's been stable has been the above-trend growth in the economy. Now, obviously, we're all watching the developments overseas. I'm not a geopolitical analyst, but what I can tell you is, you know, insofar as we're worried about oil prices, a couple of things to consider. Number one is the U.S. position as a major energy producer. We run a trade surplus in petroleum products. That's not something that we haven't been accustomed to it forever, really, in my career. That's number one. Number two is that even though oil, you know, crude prices, Brent crude prices are rising today, it's important to keep in mind that there is a lot of disinflation in the pipeline at the retail pump that's coming for motorists over this month. I wouldn't be surprised to see, you know, retail gasoline prices declining 50 cents in October. That's going to continue, Lisa, because of what we've seen in wholesale gasoline prices.
And there is that dynamic, Neil. I think on a broader level, people are trying to understand whether the ingredients are in the economy right now for a 1970s type of stagflation, given some of the growth, but also given what an oil shock would do to the current economy.
Well, I think the way to think about the oil shock so far is that we'll likely see more of an investment response than we will a consumption response. I mean, that's typically how it works. When we get a pickup in price, you know, businesses tend to respond first. So I would expect to see rig counts beginning to turn around more quickly. And I wouldn't expect to see consumer spending slowing all that much, if at all. You know, you talk about the stagflation risk. I mean, it's important to remember what the U.S. energy position was, what the nature of the economy was back then. It was much more manufacturing energy intensive than it is now. You know, that doesn't mean, you know, that stagflation can't happen. You can't rule out any scenario, but should that be the baseline right now?
Right.
You know, I'm not so sure.
Neil Dutta with us, and we will continue. Futures deteriorate, negative 31. Dow down 200 points now. The VIX out 19.91. Lisa, Brent crude $88 a barrel. Standard & Poor's 500 down 0.7%.
Too short a time with Neil Dutta. Neil, I want to just have one last question to you as we parse and work toward that CPI on Thursday. How not positioned are equity investors or the broader markets to the prospect of even higher yields to come based on the growth that you're talking about?
Well, I think, you know, it's important to kind of separate the short-run dynamics from the medium to longer-run dynamics. I think, you know, you could probably talk me into a bullish case for equities, you know, over the next few months, right? I mean, you have seasonality, which tends to be good. and the Fed is backing off. And the economy is holding up. So that's a pretty good recipe for the equity markets, at least for a trade. I would say it's a trade to rent, not necessarily own. And that goes to your point about higher interest rates. One of the things I'm struck by is that, there's still a, pervasive sense of optimism around the fixed income market. I think a lot of the people that wanted to buy, fixed income on the anticipation that yields would decline, they've already done so. So that kind of leaves only the sellers left. And we've obviously, blown through the top end of consensus estimates already in terms of rates. The consensus is offsides going into early next year. If you look at your own Bloomberg consensus, it's for basically flat growth in Q1 of 24. I would take the...
Neil, got to leave it there. Neil Dutta of Renaissance Macro, optimistic on the American economy. Coming up, the former World Bank president, Robert Zoellick, perfectly timed. Stay with us on radio, on television. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Good morning.
London will stay a financial center. It will stay our EMEA hub. We'll just have a rebalancing onto the continent. And actually, the numbers of who has moved across aren't that big. So it's sort of in the 200 level. And if you think about 15,000 people, that's sort of not that material. And so I do think both will basically continue to grow and continue to be very relevant. What will change, though, and the big thing that's changing, is actually the risk-taking is what's going to move. And so we've historically had risk-taking in the UK. That risk-taking and the assets that go with it, not the people alone, but the assets that go with it, that's the next phase of what we're now moving into. And that will be a material change.
CFOs are reshaping the C-suite. Bloomberg's chief future officer shines a spotlight on these dynamic leaders. On's running shoes have a unique look, and so does its leadership team. CFO Martin Hoffman is also co-CEO, and he thinks two jobs are better than one.
How do you balance those two roles?
I feel the CFO makes you a better CEO, and the CEO makes you a better CFO.
Watch Chief Future Officer this Wednesday on Bloomberg.
On the David Rubenstein Show, Peer-to-Peer Conversations, I uncover the untold stories of the world's most successful leaders.
Watch Wednesdays on Bloomberg Television.
Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern, right here on Bloomberg, your global business authority.
Of the Middle East is unlike Las Vegas. What happens in the Middle East never stays in the Middle East. And the Biden administration will need to develop not only a strategy to address this issue, a strategy to see how this impacts existing programs such as the Iran and Saudi and other initiatives, but likewise, they're going to have to staff this out.
That was Norman Rule earlier this morning, senior advisor for the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, as we were trying to parse through what transpired over the weekend with the attack on Israel by Hamas and then the subsequent retaliation and the conflicts that have been percolating out. We have seen risk aversion today. Tom, the bond market is closed. We heard earlier this morning from Amy Silverman that maybe it's helpful that the bond market is closed for the U.S. holiday, given the fact that stocks and you could see commodities trading somewhat in a vacuum separate from the yield space.
It is a vacuum today. There's no question about that. And we'll get information. And I would say pay attention to Bloomberg out of Asia, Yvonne Maninol out of Hong Kong. This evening is maybe we get the beginning of a bond market open there and indications of that.
And what we can see with respect to specific stocks that are moving really is a response, as you would expect, where defense contractors are getting a huge leg up with people looking to where money will be flowing. Lockheed Martin shares up almost 5%. Northrop Grumman up about 3%. General Dynamics up 3.5%. So that knee-jerk reaction go into oil as well as some of the contractors and away from from some of the riskier areas. There's a bigger question about what this means for the geopolitical community, Tom, and I think that that's really been a big question. How much of what we're seeing is a fissure of the world order that we knew and something that looks a little bit different? Someone with perspective, Robert Zoellick, joins us, former World Bank president, senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. Robert, thank you so much for being with us. First, just your thoughts on what transpired over the weekend.
Well, this is a very traumatic event for Israel, as you see in the coverage, and it's a war, and we have to expect that, while dealing with a war with Russia and Ukraine, you now have another big front, as this is just not going to be a small retaliation by Israel. This is a problem now that they're going to have to figure out how to deal with, and it's going to go on for a while.
What's your impression of just how splintered some of the global order has become over the past couple of years, especially given that the allegiance with respect to Ukraine has been splintering, and now there's a question of who's going to work with who during this period of turmoil?
Well, you clearly have a much more fragmented system, and it adds to frictions, it adds costs. The World Bank, IMF annual meetings are beginning this week in Marrakesh. I'm sure they hope that they could focus on Africa and the developing world, but the external environment is one that sort of creates wider anxiety across markets and frankly, the ability to cooperate. The U.S.-China tensions are very different than they were 10 years ago.
Robert Zoellick, across a span of decades, you are the single American most wired in to actually operating institutions and also creating policy with someone like James Baker and others. The singular feature I see now is a new isolationism in America. Witness half the jobs you used to appoint are vacant. Is America where we are now? We can't prosecute diplomacy because we have so many empty desks in our State Department and in other congressional administration cabinets?
Well, I think that's unfortunate. It hurts any administration's ability to operate, but I don't think that's the key issue. And I think as for the idea on isolationism, I think there's a mixed mood on this. The U.S. public understands the role internationally, but clearly the dysfunction that you've seen on the congressional side makes it harder for the executive branch to operate. But I think in general, the Biden administration tried to repair alliance relationships, which were obviously undercut during Trump's transactionalism. But some of these issues like the Middle East, you can just see how this will explode their effort to try to change the relationship with Israel and Saudi Arabia. That's likely to be one of the biggest.
Help us, Robert Zoellick, with Iran and the idea that you and I came out of school about the same time, and there was the shock, as we have a shock this morning, of 1979. How do you perceive the present day Iran and our ability to firmly negotiate with them, given the fury of Israel?
Well, frankly, I don't mean to be critical of the past, but I've always been skeptical of the idea you're going to be able to negotiate very effectively with this Iranian regime. As you know, they face great turmoil inside. This is not necessarily a stable situation. But when people were focusing on nuclear weapons, they also needed to focus on Iran's behavior in the region. And this is an example of this. I personally think that Hamas and the Islamic Jihad were the engines of this, but clearly they're cooperating with Hezbollah and Iran. So while I think the Biden administration, in a sense, wanted to pull back from the Middle East has forced itself back on their agenda.
Robert, this is a delicate question, but are you critical of the decision to release the $6 billion of funds to Iran and soften some of the sanctions that the U.S. had placed on that nation?
Well, I think I'd say at this point, the administration is going to have a hard time defending that decision. I understand some of the logic. I think, frankly, the administration and Israel, with the problems going on with the constitutional issues with Netanyahu, and for Iran's own reasons, kind of wanted to kick the can down the road. But this issue is firmly on the agenda, and I think they're going to have a hard time explaining what they did.
Your experiences within the State Department as well as the Trade Negotiations Department leaves you in a fantastic position to really discuss where we are in terms of lack of positions filled, including the House Speaker, the fact that we are dealing, I mean, Tom was talking about some of the ambassadors, but there really is a feeling of dysfunction in the government. What would a government shutdown next month do to the U.S.'s ability to really step in this circumstance?
Well, I think the primary effect would be on the international perceptions of the United States. You used the word dysfunctionality. Look, the U.S. Constitution was not created for one branch to be able to run it. It's always a tension with the executive and the White House. But I think, and you can see, for example, the Senate trying to work with the White House, even though there are differences between the parties. I think what's happened in the House is of a different order. And it's partly a carry-on from some of the changes that Trump promoted and some of the styles that people have politically, where it's better to try to raise their profiles and raise money than to govern. So we'll see. The United States has gone through these types of crises before, and usually it ends up pushing the extremes further away. But that depends on what the Republicans in the House decide to do.
Robert Zoellick, to take your Illinois as an example, and to use President Trump's phrase, there are lots of Republicans in name only out there. You have represented decades of Republicans in name only. What should those people do given the polarities of America? How do we find the Zoellick middle ground?
Well, I don't consider myself in name only. I served in both elections and administrations, but I have a fundamental difference with the Trump approach on domestic policy, on the Constitution, on the character of treatment. And I think if people object to what they see going on, they need to participate in the process. They need to vote. They need to be active in terms of their local communities. Look, when you look at a lot of the governors around the states, Republican and Democrat, that actually have to run something, a lot of these people are doing serious work. You got Republicans in New Hampshire, in Georgia, and other states that are having to work and govern effectively across the range of issues. So there is a strength of America. There's a resilience, just as there is on the private economic side. But I don't underestimate the threat that's been created by the Trump phenomenon.
Right. Robert Zoellick, thank you so much. He's the former president of the World Bank. It was going to be on IMF World Bank. That went out the window, and you really wonder what the themes are going to be in Marrakesh as well. Lisa, I love your conversations today on the geography of Israel. As I said to the former ambassador, Mr. Demers, the triangulation here from Gaza over to the West Bank and up to the northern border with Lebanon is frightening.
With a couple of rockets fired over near the northern border, but not full Hezbollah engagement. Some of the imagery of the Iron Dome and how many rockets that were being fired and just exploding in the air. Amazing to see, and just imagine the noise of all of those explosions as people tried to shield themselves.
Into the evening in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and of course into the evening in the Gaza Strip. We'll continue with Bloomberg's coverage here of a war in Israel and the Gaza Strip, the war of Israel and Hamas. We continue our Bloomberg television coverage. Mr. Farrell, on the open, I would single out Henrietta Trays on the changed quarters of Washington on this Monday. Please stay with us on radio and television. Futures at -28. This is Bloomberg.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
We're back
for another season of AI IRL.
My
my opinions sometimes elicit unfriendly responses from my peers, but let me try to explain my thought on it.
So to start, Twitter and X are two totally different companies in my head. Companies are driven by the culture of the people who are there. They're two totally different places.
Not to ask people about their bosses, but, you know, Mark Zuckerberg, how is it changing his priorities?
A lot of time and thought is invested into how you can innovate.
It turns out that, the popular chatbots, ChatGPT, Bard, and others are so easily hackable to actually drive a different agenda from what is bounded as a response mechanism.
There's a tipping point here where the images have become so good that really smart people who are by design critical are falling for it. That was number one. But here's the other one that really scared me.
Do you think that there's potential to see kind of an AI Rust Belt of sorts?
My personal opinion is no. That might be somewhat contrary to what others are thinking.
Do you think that it can replicate the solace and comfort some people feel with religion?
What I have seen is that it really varies depending on how people think about the way that, higher powers or the divine might move through the material world.
Steve's ability on the course may not be etched into any record books, but following him around, it's clear that it's not for lack of trying.
Jeez.
We were constantly hustling behind him as he caught up with executives in the portfolio companies and reminisced with former and current players.
He's a day trader. He taught himself, self-made day trader. Yeah. And so he's on the bus after a game in New England, and he's day trading on the bus, and Bill Belichick sees him and cuts him on the spot. In many ways, it's a convention, right, of the people that I don't see maybe once a year. And so it's kind of all come together. My firm, our charity, fundraising efforts, and then the friends that are around. My dad and my brother, it all happens right there as a confluence of all these parts of my life that have found its common center.
This is Bloomberg.
Let's try and get your week started. Live from New York City this morning. Good morning. Your equity market down by 0.7% on the S&P. The countdown to the open starts right now.
Everything you need to get set for the start of U.S. trading. This is Bloomberg, The Open, with Jonathan Farrow.
Live from New York, coming up, conflict between Israel and Hamas entering a third day. Crude oil rallying as tensions fan regional flames, and Iran rejecting reports it was directly involved. We begin with the big issue, Israel at war.
כוחות חמאס פלשו הבוקר לשטח ישראל בבוקרו של יום חג, שבת.
And President Biden pledging his support for Israel.
Today, the people of Israel are under attack, orchestrated by a terrorist organization, Hamas. In this moment of tragedy, I want to say to them and to the world and to terrorists everywhere that the United States stands with Israel. We will not ever fail to have their back.
The Wall Street Journal reporting Iranian security officials helped Hamas plan its attack in a series of meetings over months, saying Hamas was given the green light for the attack in Beirut last Monday. Secretary Blinken telling CNN over the weekend that he's seen no evidence to support that claim.
In this specific instance, we have not yet seen evidence that Iran directed or was behind this particular attack, but there's certainly a long relationship. It's one of the reasons why we have been resolutely taking action against Iran and its support for terrorists and terrorist proxies.
Joining us now is Bloomberg's Anne-Marie here in New York City. AMH, before we get into it, the question we have to answer this morning is whether Israel will directly implicate Iran for the tragic events over the weekend. We caught up with the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, a little bit earlier this morning. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Iran supports the Shia militias in Iraq. They're trying to establish a beachhead, a terrorist beachhead against Israel in Syria. Now our working assumption is that they may have. Our working assumption a couple days ago was that they hadn't known about it directly. Now it is unclear, and we'll have to wait to verify it. And, when we make an official statement, we'll make an official statement. You can imagine the sense of disgust that we have. We have to send a message to all of Israel's enemies, because we're a strong country, but we're tiny, and we can go from strength to vulnerability. I think people are going to see the strength of Israel, the might of Israel.
Anne-Marie, that working assumption has changed.
Yeah, it certainly has. And Jonathan, I've been speaking to U.S. officials and other individuals really around the world that have put a lot of cold water on that Wall Street Journal report that Iran had given the green light, and there was meetings leading up to this between Hezbollah, Hamas, and those in part of the IRGC of Iran that would have implicated Iran directly. And you asked Ron Dermer, which we should note, a former ambassador from Israel to the United States. He is a top confidant of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And when you asked him about direct evidence that would leak Iran to this massacre over the weekend, he said, it is our working assumption that there is that evidence. They have not come out directly to name what that evidence is, but that is their working assumption right now. And of course, if Iran is implicated in this, that can have serious risks to the broader region and instability, not just in the Middle East, but the globe.
Anne-Marie, from your perspective this morning, what are you focused on what next? What next in all of this?
Well, I think what next in all of this, you want to see if other individuals get involved in backing Hamas, the likes of Hezbollah, the likes of the Houthis. Also, we have learned this morning from the State Department that 9 Americans were killed. Obviously, Jonathan, many Americans potentially are still missing. Are there Americans that were taken hostage? This is something that the U.S. is trying to, or the administration is trying to work and figure out. Of course, all of this comes at a precarious position for Washington, D.C. As you mentioned a number of times today, we still do not have an appointed or confirmed Israeli ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Israel, Jack Lew. But on October 18th, Punchbowl News is reporting that he will get that committee hearing. And then, of course, there's no Speaker of the House yet. Paralysis, really, in Washington, D.C. as they deal with this international tragedy.
And nothing's been happening quickly in Washington, D.C. for a long, long time. Do you see this providing a game-changing incentive to get a move on, to change our approach to certain issues in the nation's capital?
Some analysts are saying that this can be an impetus to potentially we can get a faster speaker, or also make sure that the government remains open coming November 17th. And potentially, as we do know, that there's been a lot of discussions about aid to Ukraine. Paramount at this moment in conversations in Washington will be about aid to Israel as well.
MH, thank you. Stay close. We'll catch up with Anne-Marie through the hour here in New York City. I want to continue the conversation now with Henrietta Trays of Theta Partners. Henrietta, first of all to you, this is a tremendously difficult question to ask, but just from your standpoint, your perspective, how do you expect this will unfold across the region?
I mean, my hope is that we see the invasion of Israel really shake some things loose here in D.C., as you were just discussing with Anne-Marie. The region obviously is going to need a tremendous amount of aid, and what we've seen from the war in Ukraine is one of the first things the United States do is tries to build a coalition. Obviously, the administration has been working with Middle East nations for the last couple of months to a year to try to bring together a more strategic, coordinated approach here, but they're struggling with that, as you saw from Egypt yesterday. So I think it'll be difficult to tie the Middle East nations together, but this should be an area that the U.S. can immediately tap into. Goodwill, there's already conversations about aid coming in from Germany. So look to those NATO nations to sort of band together in their approach to Israel and providing aid right now, whether that's on the military front or from a funding perspective, which I think will be, per Israel's prime minister, something that we are dealing with for many weeks, if not months from now.
Henrietta, we have a decent understanding of America's willingness to assist. Can we talk about America's ability to assist, given the absence that we have in certain key positions across government? In the House, no speaker, no ambassador to Israel, to Lebanon, to Egypt. Does that change anything?
I mean, as I said to clients last night, I mean, I'm hoping that this could be one silver lining where this disaster and catastrophe sort of creates impetus to move, as you were just discussing. So one of the things I'd like to see happen here is Israeli aid move the speaker's election along. The internal fighting on the Republican side is so exhaustive that I'm not particularly optimistic. They're not in session today. They'll start having the first round of understanding of who the speaker is going to be on Tuesday. potentially a vote within the conference on Wednesday, and maybe, if we're very lucky, a speaker's vote on Thursday. But that'll be day 5, 6 of this now war. So obviously it's not going to be immediate. The Senate is out of session until October 17th. So you're not going to be getting a robust aid package. But what I'm optimistic about is aid to Israel can carry things like aid to Ukraine, maybe even a defense appropriations bill. And you never want to waste a disaster, is the phrasing in DC. And I think the Senate hopefully will take up that narrative and run with it.
It's often an unfortunate phrasing, but with that in mind, do you think it's now less likely we get a government shutdown November 17th?
I'm not particularly optimistic about that. I think we need to start splicing and dicing whether it's going to be a full government shutdown or partial. One of the things I could see happening here is the defense appropriations bill, or maybe something funding the State Department, is able to ride along with an Israel plus Ukraine aid package. In that scenario, you've got military workers paid. You have most of the military bases covered for the year. You have aid to Israel and Ukraine. Everything else sort of goes to the back burner. So we could have a shutdown that's partial, but potentially protracted as they try to work through individual appropriations bills. And I think what freshman members of the House do not understand is there's a reason that we lump these pieces of legislation together. It's to speed it along precisely when we have the opportunity. Otherwise, huge chunks of the government will remain unfunded for days, if not weeks.
That's the dysfunction at home. Let's talk about the prospect of escalation abroad. It's still unclear as yet, Henrietta, what Iran's direct involvement was over the weekend. Given the approach that we've seen from the administration to Iran over the last year or so, do you see that changing in a material way? And if so, how?
What we've seen from them so far is a very deliberate approach to collecting information, how they release information. We have to be mindful that it's an election year here in the United States. So there's already a number of presidential candidates jumping at this opportunity to cry foul, to say that there's something afoot that is President Biden's responsibility somehow. I think that narrative is going to be inescapable for the White House, and why you're seeing administration officials try to jump out in front of it. And it needs to be deliberate. You need to have exactly the right information before you start going out with it. But a number of presidential candidates don't necessarily feel like they need to wait for that. And we've seen that play out since the weekend.
Henrietta, thank you for an update from you. Henrietta Trace there, Aveda Partners. To continue the conversation, joining us now is Citi's Kristen Bidderly, Aberdeen's Luke Hickmore. Kristen, first to you. Do you suppose this can lead to a durable headwind to market sentiment, the events that we've seen over the weekend and the spillover this morning and beyond?
It's hard to say in terms of the reaction short term and longer term. It is one more catalyst for volatility. I think when we look at the initial market reaction, obviously with bond markets closed in the U.S., it is a risk-off sentiment. You can see that in terms of the bid for gold, bid for the dollar, and of course the jump that we saw in oil. I think the major indicator to keep an eye on right now is obviously oil. And so this debate, John, that you were talking about, in terms of Iran's involvement, it only complicates this given the fact that their oil output is up about 55% since the lows of 2020. And so the key to understanding whether this would have broader implications is clearly the scope of the regional conflict and then the pressures that it would put on in areas like the oil market.
Crude up 3.5% this morning, WTI at about 86, Brent crude at about 87. Luke Hickmore, what can you learn from the way the market has responded so far?
That we don't know enough. I think, as you've been talking about, if this widens out, if Iran gets sucked in, we can see Jordan get sucked in and potentially Russia get sucked in. John Arthurs did a brilliant note this morning from Bloomberg talking about the concentric circles around Israel and its defense risks. And ultimately, on the outside of that is Russia. So I think as an investor, you need to start preparing for what you could be facing over the next few weeks. Right now, it doesn't feel anything more than the market's done already. It's quite a small reaction. If we go through those circles, we need to be getting more and more defensive as we get further on. And also, John, I think there's a chance here that a higher oil price is a brake on growth rather than a driver to inflation, given everything we've gone through to get to this point with higher yields, higher interest rates and slower growth.
Luke, it raises the question, what is defensive? Are Treasury bonds defensive, given what you expect?
That's really hard, especially the amount that needs to be funded over the next year, the interest payments coming up as well. That's really hard, isn't it? I think possibly actually quality companies, a value trade, if you will, rather than the growth trade, who've got good income streams that are domestically oriented rather than looking for international exposure. And the same whether you're looking at it from credit or from equities, and maybe keep right down the front end of the US Treasury curve in that 5-year space, or even cash.
This was a real test for us this morning. Unfortunate in some ways that the Treasury market was closed. A real test, Kristen, to understand whether Treasuries have retained those risk mitigation characteristics, given the sell-off we have seen over the last couple of weeks, the last few months. The question I'd often ask, when bad things happen, we buy Treasuries. When bad things happen now, Kristen, are we still buying Treasuries?
I think the interesting thing will be to see in terms of whether there's really a bid for the 10-year. I think certainly what you've seen in terms of bills and the demand for cash as an asset class, we know that's been the #1 trade this year, and we've seen significant inflows into that. I think in terms of like your question around where you can hide out, from a quality perspective, I see a lot more coming into 2 to 5 years where you're getting that above 5% and even 6% on investment grade corporates. So I think the question is, you know, the 10-year, who is the buyer for the 10-year in this market? And if there is a flight to quality, are we going to see that when the market opens?
That's not an easy question to answer at the moment. Kristen Biddley, Luke Hickmore sticking with us. We'll build on this going into the opening bell. The opening bell about 17 minutes away. Equities pulling back. Off session lows, though, we're down about 0.5% on the S&P, with some movers going into the open. Here's Abby.
Well, John, as we do have the conflict between Israel and Hamas entering a third day, we have a risk-off tone for the markets, not surprisingly. This means a lot of the mega tech companies that have been up in such a big way this year, up more than 100% are down, including Tesla, NVIDIA down for that reason, but also in sympathy with the fact that Intel has planned to build a new manufacturing plant in Israel, and then the airlines are also lower, as the 3 big airlines, Delta being shown here, down about 3%, as they are paring their flights to Israel amid the conflict, trading lower. Again, a risk-off tone as this conflict between Israel and Hamas does enter a third day.
Abby, thank you. More from Abigail around the opening bell. Coming up, the US pledging its support for Israel.
In this moment of tragedy, I want to say to them and to the world and to terrorists everywhere that the United States stands with Israel.
Instability in the Middle East sending oil prices sharply higher. More on the market implications next.
Is crucially important, and I think we've moved from this attitude from it's an indulgence, a waste of time, almost an illness that needs a cure.
For something as universally important to human life as sleep, mysteries surrounding its necessity and utility have only just been recently uncovered.
Some of our biggest discoveries were in the 1970s or 1980s, and so it makes it a really exciting field because it seems as though we're uncovering new insights each and every day.
Some scientists are going further to find out how sleep and what happens there can be harnessed to further expand our understanding.
It's easy to memorize things. That makes you smart if you can spit back a lot of facts. But if you want to be wise, if you really want wisdom, you got to know when and how and why to use that information. And that's what your brain figures out while you're sleeping.
City, London, in Sydney, from Washington, in Tokyo.
9 a.m. in Beijing and Shanghai.
Good morning, everyone.
Have a great evening.
Here's what I'm watching. You do not want to miss this story.
He's there, the kind of upside.
In this moment of tragedy, I want to say to them and to the world and to terrorists everywhere that the United States stands with Israel. Israel has the right to defend itself and its people. Full stop. There's never justification for terrorist attacks.
Crude oil rallying after Hamas's surprise attack on Israel, the threat of US and Iran entanglement growing, especially if action is taken against Tehran. Sokjin weighing in on the market implications, writing this: in terms of risk premium, we see an increase of $5 to $10 per barrel. The risk of escalation is real, and while Iran may not have nuclear weapons, it does have a stranglehold on the Straits of Hormuz, through which 20 to 30% of global crude oil flows. Joining us now, a man who knows a little something about the crude market, Stuart Wallace out of Dubai. Stuart, you and the team, as you look at things right now, have you changed your expectations on crude supply coming out of the region?
Not so far. I mean, it is absolutely true to say they have a stranglehold over Hormuz, but, you know, with the proviso that no one has ever successfully managed to take Hormuz down for any length of time. So you can definitely make life more difficult. But I would also argue in the long term, it's not necessarily in the interest of Iran to do that. I mean, for one thing, just to remind to everyone, you've got the US Fifth Fleet sitting up in Manama, not that far away. Is that really sort of a bear you want to prod? I think the second leg of it, which is tougher sanctions, you know, or at least a more careful control of what's coming out of Iran, you know, that certainly is a possibility. And at a time when OPEC is still constraining supply, that would clearly have a more immediate impact on the market. So I think it's those two factors, but of the two of them, the more likely approach, at least for now, seems to be on the sanctions. But again, we'll watch and wait.
Stuart, how much crude has been coming out of Iran over the last year or so? And has the administration been turning a blind eye to that?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily as a blind eye, but yes, it is up sharply, and it's definitely been a big factor in the market. I mean, I think as one of your previous guests said, it's something in the order of about 50% over the last 12 months higher. And the expectation is that that would continue to go higher. Now, clearly the calculus has changed in the last few days, and we're really watching Washington to see how they're going to react to this. Again, that will take several weeks or several months to play out. At the same time, you've got this big calculation to make about how then, in turn, does OPEC react, Saudi Arabia in particular. It's got quite a great deal of spare capacity right now, but it's not quite clear what the appetite in Riyadh is at the moment in a scenario where Iran is constrained. Does Riyadh then reopen the spigots? It's very hard to gauge today what that reaction might be.
Stuart, thank you, sir, for your assistance from Dubai this morning. Kristen Bidley, Luke Hickmore back with us. Luke, you made a good point. You don't see this as maybe inflationary risk. You see this as a break to growth. Why, Luke? Why the latter and not the former?
I think if this had happened 6 months ago, obviously they wouldn't have hit the anniversary they wanted to hit. But if this had happened 6 months ago, we would have been higher inflation, lower interest rates. It would have fueled inflationary growth from here. But this is happening just at the point where we're probably peak interest rates, maybe getting close to peak yields, maybe a little bit hard to go for peak yields, and it feels like consumers are suffering already. You throw in even more things to take money out of their pockets every month, I'm not sure they have the scope to really push hard on more and more and more wages. And of course, that's one of the things we saw on Friday. Wage growth was not coming back whilst employment remained strong.
Kristen, in about 20 seconds, do you agree?
I agree. I think this is more a sign towards what could be a slowing economic growth environment. And so this idea that it would put further pressure on the consumer, we're already seeing soft demand watch in China, in Europe, and in the US, which is spreading when it comes from an oil perspective. So I think this actually leads to more questions around growth than inflation.
Kristen, thank you. Kristen Bidley there and Luke Hickmore. We turn now to the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ, both holding a moment of silence.
Obviously, we were trying to create shoes for me to wear in the Olympics, and that was happening pretty quickly. And then just understanding a new industry and how shoes are even made. But as we went down that path and started to just learn and research more, we learned that shoes have not been made for women. What that means is a shoe is made off of a last, which is a mold of the foot, and it's the mold of a man's foot used to make women's sneakers. And I think it took time for us to really grasp that because, you know, we've been in shoe stores and we've gone to the women's section and it's like, no, there are shoes for women. Like, what's this over here? And then to really understand, like, all of that is marketing. This is just a man's shoe, like, in a different color. And so that kind of eye-opening experience was just like, okay, we got to do this. And even more than making the shoes, like, there's a deeper purpose here. Like, women deserve better and we shouldn't be an afterthought.
Iran supports the Shia militias in Iraq. They're trying to establish a beachhead, a terrorist beachhead against Israel and Syria. Now our working assumption is that they may have. Our working assumption a couple days ago was that they hadn't known about it directly. Now it is unclear, and we'll have to wait to verify it. And, you know, when we make an official statement, we'll make an official statement. You can imagine the sense of disgust that we have. We have to send a message to all of Israel's enemies because we're a strong country, but we're tiny, and we can go from strength to vulnerability. I think people are going to see the strength of Israel, the might of Israel.
That was Ron Dermer, the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs, on Bloomberg Surveillance earlier on this morning. Joining us now is Katie Lights out of Washington, D.C. for the latest. Morning, Katie.
Good morning, John. Well, that, of course, is on the Israeli side, where we have seen hundreds of Israelis killed in these attacks over the weekend. And, of course, we have confirmation now this morning from the State Department that 9 American citizens are among those that were killed. Of course, here in Washington, you have seen really a bipartisan condemnation of what is happening in the Middle East at the moment. President Biden has pledged to continue to support Israel, which, of course, is a crucially important American ally in the Middle East. There are a few challenges here, though, John, one being that if Israel asks for any further aid that requires congressional approval, it's going to be difficult to get that in an expedient matter, considering the Senate is not in session, the House is not either, and there is no Speaker of the House to preside over the normal legislative business of that chamber. Then, of course, there is the issue that we were just hearing about, alluded to there, the issue of Iran. Remembering just last month, the U.S. released $6 billion in frozen funds in exchange for the return of hostages from Iran. There is a lot of question now about the role Iran has played, how U.S. policy may or may not have factored in. And then, of course, there's the reaction to the intelligence failure that was here, knowing that there was a real lapse in intelligence, that these attacks were not seen coming by both Israeli intelligence, and, of course, there is U.S. intelligence that could play a role there as well. So a lot of questions that remain unanswered, but the U.S. is promising to be there for Israel at this point.
Particularly how policy comes together, given the dysfunction we've seen in Washington, D.C. over the last several months. Katie, thank you. More from Katie Lights and Bloomberg's Anne-Marie a little bit later on this hour. We'll catch up with them in about 20 minutes. Just to turn to the broader price action, we're shaping up as follows on the S&P 500. We are turning just a little bit higher. We're off session highs. We're down by about 0.4% on the S&P. In the bond market, yields are unchanged on treasuries because they are not trading. We're looking at the bond market at the moment, where yields were lower through much of this morning. And in foreign exchange on a euro, 105.46. Coming up, Hamas's surprise attack on Israel threatening to inflame tensions in the Middle East. JMP Group's Mark Lehman joins us at the opening bell. Your cash open just around the corner.
The younger generations are more, of course, pay more attention to sustainability, and so they are looking at brands that are greener. But you have to make sure you're authentic because they hate greenwashing. But what is very important to remember is that none of them, whether they're young or not, will ever sacrifice product quality and efficacy to sustainability, which is why, part of the big transformation of our R&I, where there's this €1 billion we spend every year, most of it is spent on transforming our formulas from petrochemicals to biosourced ingredients and green sciences, but without losing the efficacy.
From the world of politics to the world of business, every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, hosts Anne-Marie Hordern and Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines deliver news, insight, and analysis live from Bloomberg's Washington headquarters. Get the latest from and about politics' biggest power players at the end of every trading day. Balance of Power, every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Seconds away from the opening bout this morning. Good morning. We're pulling back on the S&P. On the Nasdaq, we're down about 0.5% on the S&P 500, down by 0.7% on the Nasdaq. Best weekly gain on the S&P 500 last week since the 1st of September. The opening bout for a new week goes off right now. Switch to the board against the bond market. Yields look like this in the bond market. Treasuries are closed. In the bond market, we saw a rally a little bit earlier on today. Yields a little bit lower, so ignore that price on a 10-year yield. In the Treasury market. In the FX market, the euro negative by 0.4%, 105.47. Crude rallying by 3.6%, 85.82. Let's turn to energy stocks and get to Abby. Morning, Abby.
Good morning, John. And we do right now have the shares of Chevron along with other energy stocks trading higher. This, of course, after Israel did order the shutdown of a key gas field in Israel as the violence rages. We have, as a result, natural gas rallying in a huge way. And you can see Chevron and some of the other big energy companies are rallying. Natural gas in Israel has really transformed that economy over the last couple of decades and turned it into an exporter of the fuel. This stoppage has, of course, resulted in lower onward shipments or even delays after Egypt was planning to resume liquefied natural gas exports. In any case, there is a supply shortage for natural gas. So European natural gas up again more than 10%. As for oil, as you were mentioning, there is the question of whether or not Iran is going to be dragged into what the role of Iran will be in this conflict. Will they get sucked in? As Luke Hickmore of Aberdeen was saying, oil, of course, is rallying right now. Both WTI and Brent up about 3 to 4%. Investors really trying to figure out what the scope of this regional conflict will be. And Luke Hickmore, of course, also making that interesting observation that if oil does rise, and he was even saying Jordan and Russia could potentially get sucked in, that it would be a break on growth rather than inflationary. Too early to know that, of course, but what we do know, John, today is that the energy complex is rallying on this conflict between Israel and Hamas.
Abby, thank you. About 2 minutes into the session, we pulled back by 0.4% on the S&P, on the Nasdaq down by about 0.8. Let's get to the airlines. Simone Foxman has the story. Hey, Simone.
Hey, John. Yeah, the FAA warning airlines about travel to the region. And the president of the Allied Pilots Association, which represents 15,000 American Airlines pilots, says it is not prudent or appropriate to knowingly put our flight crews and passengers in harm's way by maintaining flights to a war zone, also directing all pilots to cease flight operations to Israel until they can be reasonably reassured of the region's safety and security. Shares of all the big three in the United
United States down. Delta down 4.8%. United and American both falling in early trading, down well over 4% as well. This has been a big hit to European carriers in trading as well. Lufthansa Group just saying it canceled Tel Aviv flights through October 14th. Interesting to note which airlines, though, are still flying. British Airways, Iberia, Express, both of those owned by IAG. IAG shares down more than 5%. In London, Emirates Fly Dubai also still flying. Now, this may be in partly a reaction to the jump in oil prices. We've already seen the big three, as well as airlines across the world, warn about rising fuel prices and how that would take a hit on its third quarter earnings. Also, it's going to be a challenge for these airlines to avoid Israeli airspace. Think about Syrian airspace already closed, Ukraine, Russia. So it may incur some additional costs for these airlines to fly around that space. We will continue, but the mood clearly negative in the airline sector this morning, John.
Down close to 5%. American Airlines off by 4.8. Simone, thank you. Let's turn to chips. Nvidia and Applied Materials are being dragged down over the potential impact of Intel's plans to build a new manufacturing plant in Israel. Ed Ludlow has the story. Hey, Ed.
Yeah, good morning, Jonathan. Intel already has around 12,000 people in Israel. In June, it confirmed a plan to build a wafer fab, which was due to be operational by 2027, a $25 billion deal, according to Netanyahu at the time. And so now there's concern about what might happen with that. And how that might impact the industry's plans to try and diversify its supply chain away from Southeast Asia. You'll remember that, excuse me, last month, Intel also had to walk away for a deal to buy Tower Semi, another Israeli company, because China's regulator didn't approve the deal in time. I'd also take a look at shares of Mobileye, Jonathan, down almost 6% in the session. This is actually Israel's biggest company by market cap. It's US listed, but based in Jerusalem. The company told me this morning that their operations have not been impacted by the attack at the weekend, but I'm told by sources that they had planned to hold a significant investor day next month, November 14th or 15th, and now the timing of that investor day and a technology demo is being reviewed because of what happened at the weekend and security concerns. Also, take a look at NVIDIA. It has cancelled its AI summit, which was due to be held October 15th and 16th in Tel Aviv, citing basically the safety and well-being of those that were due to attend. So when we look about the technology sector, Israel, of course, deep ties to the tech sector globally, a center of innovation, takes a lot of VC dollars. But in the chip sector, that's where we're seeing the reaction in the market this morning.
Ed, thank you, sir. Looking out for your coverage a little bit later today, noon Eastern, Bloomberg Technology with Ed Ludlow and Caroline Hyde. Let's turn to defense. Those stocks jumping as they benefit from the geopolitical risk, with more defense spending possibly on the horizon. Katie Greifeld has this. Hey, Katie.
Hey, John. Yeah, aerospace and defense stocks, natural beneficiaries of this geopolitical conflict. Today is no exception, particularly in Europe. You saw the likes of German sensor maker Hensoldt rally as much as 13%, while Swedish defense company Saab climbed nearly 10% as well. You take a look stateside. Currently, you have Lockheed Martin up about 7.5%. And the logic is straightforward that you just walked through. You have greater government spending on defense that benefits those companies' share prices. That logic has been at work all year in this sector. If you take a look at Goldman Sachs' basket of European defense stocks, it's up nearly 28% so far this year, posted its best day in a year today. You compare that to the stock 600, only up about 4.5% in 2023.
Katie, thank you for the update. Lockheed Martin there up by more than 7%. Earlier in the session, about 6 minutes in, we're down here by 0.4%, down about 1 percentage point on the NASDAQ. I want to continue the conversation now with JMP Group's Mark Lehman. Mark, it's been a while. It's good to catch up, sir. Had a series of guests this morning talking up safety. Safety will have a different definition to different people, Mark. What's the definition of safety to you?
Well, today, safety is buying oil and defense stocks and selling technology stocks and obviously selling stocks that are domiciled in Israel. And I think that's the knee-jerk reaction and unsurprising, and it'll become more clear what the reaction will be long-term over time. But for today, this is exactly what you would expect. Interesting, obviously, with the bond market closed because of the holiday, seeing what would happen with that.
The tech stocks, a form of defense for you, Mark.
Yes, the tech stocks are definitely what people are interested in today. Unfortunately, that's going to be the call all over the street for the next few days, because clearly this is not going to be a short conflict. This is going to be a conflict that takes some time. And unfortunately, that's going to be the rallying cry globally, because this is not just Israel. This is all over the globe right now with what's going on in Ukraine and in other geographies.
I've asked a few guests this question this morning already, Mark. I'd love to get your thoughts on it, whether you do think this can lead to a durable headwind to market sentiment. I sense from your early comments that you do.
Well, this is not going to be quick, and I think there's a real problem, I think, with people finding sustainability with a rally, potentially, obviously, with what's going on with rates domestically and what's going on with our economy. I think there's just this is another thing that we did not worry about a week ago that we're going to be worried about for a very long time. And I think this kind of instability that is going on globally, obviously, we're going into an election year next year, which is very troubling sometimes for the stock market. Now you have more to worry about. When you have more to worry about, you sell. And that's what I think is going to take a little bit of the wind out of a potential rally going into year end.
It's always difficult to know what to do with these things, Mark. Just looking at the move we're seeing in crude at the moment, WTI is up by more than 4%, 86.20. Brent crude up by about 3.7%, 87.70. I've been asking whether this would contribute to inflation risk, upside inflation risk going forward. Luke Hickmore of Aberdeen said he thinks this puts the brakes on growth. Is that the way you see it, the latter and not the former?
I think it's the right question. I think it's really hard to gauge this, 72 hours or so into the conflict. I think this is clearly going to be inflationary in the near term, and it's going to cause a little bit of panic in some of those global markets and energy. And I think that will probably put a lid on things. But we had some other things that were dampening down inflation in the fourth quarter. I think this will add to that. And I think, again, we've probably seen the Fed, which was potentially going to be on hold anyway. This probably adds the fuel to that narrative that they may not have to raise in the next cycle.
Mark, for much of the last decade, inflation was low. It was predictable. Can we finish there? Just how much has things changed in the last few years? How different is this regime?
It's funny, Jonathan, I was on Friday. I spent some time with some portfolio managers at a large mutual fund complex here, and we talked just about that. And we talked about how jarring this is for the investor base, but we also talked about where the normal was way back when, frankly, my career started, where you kind of had the 3 to 4% kind of targets and things like that in terms of growth, in terms of interest rates being kind of in the zip code, what we were used to before this. And they said, you know what, it ain't so bad. And I think that will become the narrative in 2024. Let's put a little bit of the politics aside. Let's put a little bit of the tragedy that's going on in Israel aside and talk a little bit about that. And that's not so bad. And they said predictability of that rate backdrop is far better than the fear of higher rates versus the zeros we've had for so long.
Mark, thank you, sir, for the insight. Mark Lehman there of JMP Securities. You brought a market at the moment about 10 minutes into the session, down 1/3% on the S&P, on the Nasdaq down by 0.9. Lots of talk about the Federal Reserve. Not much talk of that this morning whatsoever, but one big headline across the Bloomberg in the last hour. The Fed president out of Dallas, Lori Logan, saying high yields may mean less need to raise rates, in line with what we heard from Mary Daly, the San Francisco Fed president, to Bloomberg's Lisa Abramowitz last week at the Economic Club in New York. So there it is again. Dallas Fed President Lori Logan saying higher yields may mean less need to raise interest rates. Betty talked about this morning the bond market, the Federal Reserve, and the fact we get a CPI print a little bit later on this week. Again, if you're just joining us, about 11 minutes into the session, we are pulling back on the S&P 500 by about 1/3%, down about 0.9% on the Nasdaq. Coming up, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer confronting President Xi over Israel.
I also made a request, a direct request to President Xi, that the foreign ministry strengthen their statement on the Middle East.
Team coverage up next.
boundaries of the entertainment world are blurry, and they're all scrambling for the same thing, screen time. And navigating this multiverse is no simple task. At Bloomberg Screen Time, it's culture, business, converged. Bloomberg Screen Time, Naya Studios, Los Angeles, October 11th and 12th. Get your tickets at BloombergLive.com/screentime.
I know one of the reasons you're here in Marrakesh and in Africa because you see the enormous potential this continent has as a source of renewable power for electrolysis, right? That's the process by which hydrogen is extracted from water. Tell us about Africa's potential.
Africa's potential is the best in the world, and it's Africa's shot now. It's Africa's turn. What will stop Africa rightfully taking its turn will be lack of progress on technology. Companies and governments around the world choose Fortescue because we are the world leaders in technology, world leaders in next era electrolyzer design, cables, solar, all the tech which is moving our world on from having to rely on dinosaur era fossil deposits of oil, coal and gas to simply today's era of machines which make machines to harness all that beautiful renewable energy and give all the mobile energy, all the fixed energy this world could ever need by many times. Those countries who resist that are denying Africa their opportunity. And I'm saying, stop it. Let's get in behind Africa.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
I also made a direct request to President Xi that the foreign ministry strengthen their statement on the Middle East, which didn't even mention the loss of the horrible, gut-wrenching loss of civilian life. I'm gratified the foreign ministry issued a new statement that did condemn the loss of civilian life.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer urging President Xi Jinping to stand with Israel during a visit to Beijing after China reiterated support for an independent Palestinian state. The bipartisan delegation of U.S. senators arriving in China seeking economic reciprocity. This as key seats remain empty on Capitol Hill, including House Speaker and Ambassador to Israel. The House set to cast speakership votes on Wednesday. Democratic lawmakers reportedly pushing for a quick confirmation of Biden's nominee for Ambassador to Israel, Jack Lew, in an upcoming October 18th hearing. Your team coverage starts right now with Bloomberg's Anne-Marie in New York, Katie Lyons down in Washington, D.C. AMH, good morning.
Good morning, John. What you see here when you have Senator Chuck Schumer and Senator Mike Crapo going over to China first is very unusual because remember in June, Xi Jinping sat down with Secretary Blinken, but he didn't sit down with other Biden cabinet officials, but he decided to take a congressional meeting. And what Chuck Schumer did there, the Senate Majority Leader, is he wanted to make first and foremost that he was really annoyed with China's statement over the weekend regarding the attack on Israeli civilians from Hamas. That statement didn't even mention Hamas and just called for, de-escalating of tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. That was the first order of business and really overshadowed this meeting, Jonathan, was supposed to be about economic fairness, supposed to be at fentanyl coming into the United States, and also about human rights abuses in China.
You've raised this question. How did the Senate Majority Leader get a meeting that so many others have struggled to get?
Well, it's a great question. We do know that in 2015, Xi Jinping decided to meet with congressional leaders when he was in Washington, D.C. on a state visit. Potentially, he feels that he does need to make those inroads in Congress, especially on a bipartisan basis, because, Jonathan, there is one issue that brings Democrats and Republicans together on Capitol Hill, and that has to do with confronting China.
Katie, we keep going back to this, the prospect of escalation abroad, the dysfunction at home. Let's talk about the dysfunction at home. No speaker in the House, no ambassador to Israel, to Egypt, to Lebanon. Katie, does that complicate things in any way, shape or form?
It certainly does, especially just in terms of expediency, John. How quickly the Congress, for example, would be able to approve further aid to Israel if necessary when you don't have an operational House of Representatives at the moment, and also the Senate is not even in session, which is why the consideration of Jack Lew for the post of Israeli ambassador, that confirmation hearing isn't even going to happen until next week. And while Democrats are pushing for his confirmation to happen quickly, if there is not unanimous consent in the Senate to accelerate that process, it risks being prolonged. Then, of course, in the House, it really is a question of when there will be a House Speaker once again. Of course, that is something the Republicans are going to try to answer this week. Lawmakers will be returning to Washington tonight. Tomorrow, the Republican conference will have a closed-door meeting in which they will hear from both of the candidates for Speaker. At this point, John, there are only two. Jim Jordan from Ohio, the chair of the Judiciary Committee, who appeals more to the hard right flank of the Republican Party, and Steve Scalise, a longtime member of House leadership, one that likely will appeal to more moderates. The difficulty, though, John, is that it's really unclear at this point that either of them could get the requisite 217 votes that they need in order to actually get the Speaker's gavel. So we could be looking here at a protracted fight to even get someone at the helm of the House of Representatives who is able to see legislation be put to the floor and voted on. It really just delays everything. And of course, it just adds to the optics of dysfunction in the U.S. at home, which obviously casts a shadow as to what the U.S. is doing abroad as well.
More and more delays. AMH, with that in mind, do the tragic events of the weekend inspire change for you in Washington? Are we going to actually really get a sense of urgency that we haven't had for a long time?
Well, potentially. There is that urgency that Kayleigh just spoke about, which is about moving ahead with these postings in the Middle East, like Jack Lew, who is nominated by the president in September to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel. Now that the confirmation potentially will be moved up. We know that he's going to have a committee hearing starting next week. So there is a little bit more impetus for Washington to start making some moves. On the House side, though, Jonathan, to Kayleigh's point, it is going to be difficult to get to 217, but potentially this starts to make these Republicans feel the need to coalesce around an individual sooner rather than later. People will talk about this could take days or weeks. Maybe they wrap it up sooner.
Anne-Marie, we understand the optics of all this. It looks terrible to have no ambassadors in key positions in a situation like this one, in a region where we need them right now. How significant is it, just when it comes to putting together policy and a response to the events of the weekend?
I got to be honest with you, most people I talk to say they just don't care who the ambassador is. A lot of these ambassadors are political appointees, and the fact of the matter is, on the ground, what you do have is staff that have been there for years that are doing the work. You have charge d'affaires that are doing the work, like we have in Jerusalem right now. So yes, optically, does it look good? Definitely not. But is it changing anything on the ground? Probably not. Also, when you look at the Middle East and how they have a dialogue with Washington, D.C., a lot of it actually happens in Washington, D.C., with the Saudi ambassador in Washington, with the Qatar ambassador in Washington. A lot of the dialogue is a little bit more direct with the West Wing and those nations.
MH, thank you. The update there from Anne-Marie and Kelly Lyons in New York and Washington, D.C., respectively. About 21 minutes into the session, we're off the lows. On the S&P 500, we're down about 0.2%. On the Nasdaq, we're down about 0.5%. If you want to turn to some bond market action, turn to Germany. That market is open. Yields are lower by about 4 basis points on a German 10-year. That haven bid, classic risk aversion, textbook stuff, seen it all morning. See it in the bond market. Clearly bunds, even with the backdrop over the last few months, retaining some risk mitigation characteristics. In the FX market, the dollar stronger. We expect to see dollar strength. You see it in G10. The euro down to about 105.52 on a euro negative 0.3%. And in the commodity market, rallying by about 3%. Not a major move, given what we've seen so far. Last week, remember, worst week for crude going back to March. Biggest weekly loss since spring. 85 on WTI. On Brent crude, about 87, positive 2.9%. With a sector price action on this equity market, let's get to Abby for more. Hey, Abby.
Hey, John. Well, we are looking at a smaller decline, a paired decline to your point. The S&P 500 down about 0.25%. But the sector composition really shaped by the conflict in the Middle East. Consumer discretionary, the worst sector on the day, down 1.4%. It's your cruise lines, your airlines, the Airbnbs of the world, the Expedias, the Booking.coms, hotels. Those are the worst first laggards on fears that this conflict really could weigh on global travel. To the upside, energy down up 2.4%. Industrials higher on the defense contractors. But here are those airlines over since the July 13th peak, John, down about 31% as oil took a toll on the airlines. Oil rising, more recently, to your point, oil reversed, but now as we have airlines pulling back some of their services to Israel, and again, fears that it could impact global travel, airlines down on the day and over that time period pretty drastically.
Abby, thank you. The latest on the price action. A lot still to come this week. On the economic front, tons of data, PPI, CPI, a lot of Fed speak in the mix as well. Looking ahead to the Federal Reserve meeting, only several weeks away. Coming up next, your trading diary.
That's me, Max. What's up? How are you? I have been writing about Wall Street for almost 15 years. And what that means is I write about feuds and rage and rises and falls and comebacks. And every now and then, I also write about a couple of villains. Thank you so much. And now, I am about to do something new and very, very scary. We are making a show, and it's based on Bloomberg Businessweek magazine. So what is this show about? It's a show about money, power, culture, pop business. We're gonna ask complicated and profound people about their ideas, their careers, their lives, their risks, their failures, their imagination.
It's so incredibly liberating not to care what other people think.
I was giving my tools to other communities. I wanted to bring those tools home.
Tune in. Please, really actually tune in. I desperately need an audience.
Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg?
That is a great question.
It's a great question.
Great question.
Great question.
That's a question I get all night.
Bloomberg, top experts, great questions.
This was the largest operational and intelligence failure in the history of the Israeli military and Israeli government.
It's quite clear that the Israelis underestimated their adversary. Simply couldn't comprehend the notion, even though the idea of Hamas operatives tunneling, Hezbollah operatives in the north tunneling, had been a major concern of Israel before.
Do not expect anything, and that is going, any kind of peace or calm in the next 36 hours, and probably this is going to bleed over into international markets.
The complexity of this attack from Hamas's perspective was not only incredibly successful, but it was incredibly impressive. And I think U.S. officials, Israeli officials, are going to have to really re-examine some of their base assumptions going forward.
The reaction to the tragic events over the weekend in Israel. The price action slightly negative by 0.2%. The trading diary, the week ahead looks like this. Fed Governor Jefferson speaks at 1:30 Eastern. Tuesday, more Fed speak. Wednesday, PPI and FOMC minutes. Then on to Thursday, more data, US CPI and jobless claims. And on Friday, big banks kick off with JP Morgan earnings. From New York, this was the countdown to the open. This is Bloomberg.
crucially important. And I think we've moved from this attitude from it's an indulgence, a waste of time, almost an illness that needs a cure.
For something as universally important to human life as sleep, mysteries surrounding its necessity and utility have only just been recently uncovered.
Some of our biggest discoveries were in the 1970s or 1980s, and so it makes it a really exciting field because it seems as though we're uncovering new insights each and every day.
Some scientists are going further to find out how sleep and what happens there can be harnessed to further expand our understanding.
It's easy to memorize things. That makes you smart if you can spit back a lot of facts. But if you want to be wise, if you really want wisdom, you got to know when and how and why to use that information. And that's what your brain figures out while you're sleeping.
The top names in business are on Bloomberg.
I see a world where financial conditions have gotten tighter, and the transition mechanism, which the Fed would like to see in slowing down the economy, which we all expected, it's taken a lot longer. So the real impact of higher costs around the globe, in the U.S. and Western Europe, it's not been felt yet. And so when people say, well, we're going to have a soft landing, I'm skeptical.
Nobody covers business like Bloomberg. Context changes everything. Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg. Context changes everything. This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney.
We got a lot of green on the screen here, but the volume is light. This is a market that's much more optimistic or bullish than maybe the central bankers are. 9.5 million job openings. What are people doing? Are they just sitting in Starbucks all day?
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
There's still some concern out there in the market that there is room for things to deteriorate a little bit more than what they're indicating.
As small and medium-sized businesses struggle, they don't present as much competition.
What are you guys thinking about hardware, software? How should investors approach this thing called AI?
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Good Monday morning from the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio in New York City to our worldwide audience. Coming up, we're going to get the latest reporting on the conflict in Israel. We have our Bloomberg reporter in Tel Aviv. We'll be checking in with Anne-Marie Hordern here in New York, also giving us the view from Washington, D.C. On the markets, Ethan Devitt, CIO at Moneta Group, is also going to join us this hour to give the market's reaction to what is happening in the geopolitical space, including what's happening in the energy infrastructure. So we're going to break it all down, what the news means, and how it is impacting markets and economies. But first, let's kick things off with John Tucker and a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, there's some green on the screen right now. The major stock averages mixed off the worst levels of the session. You had 5 of the 11 major industry groups in the S&P 500 lower. Worst performer, consumer discretionary. Energy, the best performer, of course, as oil prices are up about 3%, as you mentioned, Paul. NVIDIA, Amazon, Tesla, Apple, some of the biggest decliners, dragging on the tech-heavy NASDAQ 100. Matt Maley at Miller Tabak among investors keeping a close eye in the Mideast.
You know, there's so much uncertainty out there. I think a lot of people believe that this is a type of situation that you know, it really is going to have to escalate in a significant way, especially with Iran, for this to become a big problem.
Right now, the Dow is up 4 points at 33,408. The S&P 500, 7 points lower, down 0.2%, 4301 on the index. And right now, the NASDAQ 100, 71 points lower. That is down 0.5%. Wall Street analysts initiating coverage of ARM Holdings stock, mostly bullish appraisals. Right now, that stock is up close to 2%, 1.9%. We check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Matt and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney, live here in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We are streaming live on YouTube, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. Futures were decidedly negative earlier this morning, kind of doing a little bit better in the cash market here. Let's check in with Abigail Doolittle, who covers all these markets for us. She joins us here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. Abigail, what are you seeing out there in this early trading?
So we do, to your point, have stocks well off the pre-market lows. The S&P 500 right now down about 0.2%. But from a sector standpoint, it is really being shaped by the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Earlier, it really felt like a risk-off tone. At the end of the day, for stocks, and I have a hard time even talking about it because it's such a tragic event in this way, but at the end of the day, for stocks, investors are going to assess whether or not it's going to affect the U.S. corporate profit outlook. So the fact that we have stocks off the lows, that's the assessment right now. But if we dig deeper and we go sector-wise, there's lots of different sectors that are trading on these geopolitical tensions, this conflict, this tragedy, and more specifically to the downside, consumer discretionary is the worst sector on the day, down 1.5%. It's down on your cruise lines. It's down on your casinos, anything related to travel, Airbnb. We also have the airlines down sharply, and all of this on the idea that folks may not want to travel amid this sort of a conflict, not knowing how far it's going to reach, how far it's going to stretch. The S&P 500 airline index is down close to 5%. Its worst day since March, now down about 30% from the peak. Rising oil also a piece of this story, not helping out the airlines. Not surprisingly, energy is the best sector on the day, up 3.1%. Now, oil itself is not rallying in a huge way. It is up solidly. It's up about 3 to 4%, not surging. Technically, though, it's back above the 50-day moving average. And this, of course, is it's unclear whether or not Iran is going to be pulled into this conflict. We even had a guest on the Open, Lou Kickmore of Aberdeen, saying maybe Jordan and Russia, that if supply really comes off, Iran's supply over the last year or so has been up about 50%, with the expectation it would continue. So right now on that possible supply shortage in the future, we don't know, again, whether or not that's going to happen. We do have oil higher in that energy sector higher. Industrials also one of the best sectors, and this as the defense contractors absolutely surged. Right. Some of those stocks up more than 5%. In fact, the S&P 500.
Well, Raytheon,
yeah,
Boeing,
Raytheon, exactly.
Lockheed Martin.
Exactly. And that index, this is interesting to me at least. And it's uncomfortable from the standpoint of what it might suggest relative to this conflict and the tragedy. But this index at the lows down 4.7%, the worst since 2020, so more than around the war in Ukraine. So investors are really trying to sort this out right now.
I think we can use Ukraine as kind of a blueprint. Again, as you say, it's hard to talk about these things
so hard
in terms of, the economic effect and the market's reaction, because your first concern is with the people who were
and the tragedy.
Killed, who were wounded, who were kidnapped, and we're talking about thousands of people.
Children. It's
exactly.
Awful. It's just horrible.
It's horrendous. On the other hand, I think about the supply chain shortages that hit after Russia invaded Ukraine, and I wonder, do we have even more supply chain exposure to Israel? Because obviously we have a free trade agreement with Israel. We do a heck of a lot of import-export with that country, and they're very high-tech.
That's interesting, and agreed on all of the sentiment that you just shared. It's very difficult to have these conversations at a time like this. There was a guest, and I don't recall his name, also on the Open, and he was talking about companies that are based in Israel that investors are probably going to move away until there's more certainty. Where there's a little more knowledge is Chevron. Israel ordered the shutdown of one of their key gas fields, liquefied natural gas. European natural gas is up 13%. So that's not exactly apples to apples supply chain that you're talking about, but there is a situation where that is a direct shutdown of a supply chain, so to speak, where we're seeing a big effect on European natural gas. I believe in terms of companies that come to mind based out of Israel, some of the security, the cybersecurity companies. Also, there was actually one of the smaller specialty drug companies.
Right.
I think it's too early to really, for any investor, I think it's too early, really, to talk about it that specifically, but
Right.
there was an investor that was speaking about that. I think that folks are really trying to get their arms around how wide and how long and how far will this conflict get extended, and really, truly, is Iran going to get dragged in, because that would turn it into probably something much bigger and different.
Yeah. All right, Abigail, thank you so much for joining us. Abigail Doolittle covers all the markets for Bloomberg. We appreciate getting some of her time here this morning. Also joining us, Anne-Marie Hordern, Washington correspondent for Bloomberg Television. She is based in Washington. She is in New York today covering this breaking news. Anne-Marie, what's been the response from Washington, D.C.? I guess it's surprised like everybody else, but kind of what's been kind of the messaging coming out of D.C.?
The messaging has been that they will have Israel's back. The U.S. is already sending warships closer to Israel in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea. There's talk of more aid that'll be going to Israel. Blinken over the weekend talked about, and there's a lot of questions about what do you do right now, and there feels like there's paralysis in Washington, given there's no Speaker of the House. He talked about the memorandum between Israel and the United States over the years for $3.8 billion a year in security assistance. So the U.S., from Biden on down, the message has been we have an ironclad support for Israel. And that's really what it is now. Obviously, there are also concerns. You had the spokesperson for the State Department come out today and talk about 9 American lives that were lost during this tragedy over the weekend, this massacre from Hamas into Israeli territory. And of course, they're going to be talking to those families, but they're also have to figure out, were there more Americans that died, or are there Americans likely, potentially, that are actually hostages?
Well, think about how many Israelis are dual citizens with U.S. passports. That number, you have to imagine, climbs. To me, I'm surprised that we had what looks like such a huge intelligence failure, that not only Mossad, but also U.S. intelligence services had no idea this was happening and seem still to have little idea of, the involvement in Iran. At the same time as Wall Street Journal journalists are able to confirm from Hamas and Hezbollah that Iran not only gave the green light, but participated in planning sessions in Beirut. And the Journal has as much knowledge as to say exactly who was in these meetings. Meanwhile, Blinken and the U.S. intelligence services seem to have no idea.
Well, they're also putting a lot of cold water in that report, and I've spoken to a lot of sources who are concerned with some of the details in that report. And a lot of Israelis at the moment are still trying to figure out the extent of Iran's cooperation or backing of this. First and foremost, we know that Iran backs Hamas. They fund it, they back Hezbollah, they back the Houthis. This is very well known for years. How much evidence is there that links them directly to this type of infiltration, this type of attack, this type of massacre that occurred? The questions remain there. But Tom, John, and Lisa this morning on Surveillance spoke to the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. He's now a key confidant of Netanyahu. He's actually the individual that's doing the normalization talks between Saudi Arabia and Israel through the United States. And he said this, I'm trying to find the exact quote, but he talked about, here it is, quote, now our working assumptions that they, Iran, may have. Our working assumption a few days ago is that they hadn't known about it directly. Now it is unclear, and we'll have to wait to verify it. I want to make sure when I say it, when we know 100% certainty, that is our working assumption right now. So they have some evidence that links Iran directly. They don't want to talk about it at this exact moment, but he says, is our working assumption that Iran was involved. The issue, of course, if Iran becomes a part of this, and there's some sort of attack, say, by Israel towards Iran, that just creates a bigger risk for a broader conflict in this region.
Yep, that's right where we are right now. So the next couple of days, obviously, will be critical. Anne-Marie, thanks so much for taking a few minutes. I know you're incredibly busy, have been throughout the weekend, giving us some of your time here. Anne-Marie Hordern, she is a White House correspondent for Bloomberg Television. Right now, we want to get to the ground in Tel Aviv. We're joined by Galit Altstein. She is the economic and government reporter with Bloomberg News based in Tel Aviv. Galit, thanks so much for joining us. I know this is an incredibly difficult time for everyone in that part of the world. What can you tell us about the latest reporting on the ground?
So basically, we're looking at a couple of things here. On the southern front of Israel, which is in the Gaza vicinity, until this morning at least, there were still infiltrations of Hamas militant attackers who managed to come through the fence. This was on a much lower scale than it obviously was on Saturday when they came by, as it turns out, by the hundreds. By the way, the IDF is talking about 1,000 Hamas attackers who broke the fence and just went into Israel on Saturday morning. So what I started saying is that until this morning, we were still seeing infiltrations on a much smaller scale, and there were still combat arenas in the south of Israel with defense forces trying to get hold of Israeli communities and settlements in the south of Israel and trying to sort of, clean them of potential, attackers there, and at the same time trying to evacuate most of the settlements, Israeli settlements and communities who are just by the Gaza fence. There are about 24 of them, I think, and I think that so far 15 have been evacuated, and they're still working on the rest. So that is what is going on the south of Israel. Later on today, and that is basically under control at this time. In the north of Israel, it has been relatively quiet until this afternoon. It is still not a very bad situation there, but we have seen a bit of mortar fire fired from Lebanon, and there was also a very minor infiltration. And the IDF, I'm looking at my phone to be exact on what they said. They did put out a message about a couple of hours ago that they had killed a number of armed suspects that infiltrated into Israel from Lebanese territory. Hezbollah has denied connection with this, which is important because everyone is also now looking at Hezbollah to see if they will join the attacks on Israel to form like a sort of multi-front arena.
Can I ask, Matt Miller here in New York, and really appreciate you joining us, and I understand how difficult it must be to report on this right now. But what do we know about Israel's plans to go into Gaza, and how are civilians in Gaza going to get out? Because of course they've got borders on all sides and the ocean and the Med. So it seems like they're stuck. How can they get out if Israel's going to sweep in militarily?
Yeah, so this is a very good question because, Matt, we've been hearing IDF officials who have been briefing journalists about twice or more than that every day. And just this morning, one of the IDF spokespeople told us, journalists, that they will be evacuating Gaza when asked if Israel will actually be evacuating Gaza, because Israel does not control Gaza at this time. So he said no, but we will recommend they evacuate, on their own. And this is a very good question that has not been answered yet, and this is definitely something to keep pushing the IDF to give answers on, because the answer to that is not clear. Although the IDF is saying we will want people to evacuate, we do not know how. We do know that at this time, the Gaza Strip has been cut off from electricity supply, water supply, fuel supply, and other supplies as well, because all passages have been shut down. One of the main passages, by the way, the Erez passage, was one of the breach points through which the attackers came through on Saturday. And IDF officials have been telling us on record, we're not in a hurry, to rebuild this passage because this is what it was used for.
Right. So what do we know about the hostages and maybe any plans to get them back?
Yeah, so obviously, all sides are keeping their cards very, very, very close to their chests at this point. There have been various reports today about some sort of negotiations going on, mainly negotiations to free women and children who were taken hostage into Gaza in turn for women prisoners of Hamas that are being held in Israel. An official Israeli source, a high-ranking official Israeli source, who asked not to be named, but he has denied that explicitly. And I think that Hamas, although to be frank, I'm not sure who in Hamas, have also just over the past hour denied that there's any negotiations going on. So it's nothing very firm, that is going on at this stage.
All right, Galit, thank you so much for joining us. We know it's a very, very difficult time, and we appreciate getting some of your time and your reporting. Galit Altstein, Israel economy and government reporter with Bloomberg News, based in Tel Aviv. So we will continue to bring you the latest reporting on this situation as it evolves throughout the day. Looking at the markets right here, S&P 500 off about 0.25%. The NASDAQ off about 0.6%. The bond market in the United States is closed today for the Columbus Day holiday. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. Negotiations between the Culinary Workers Union and the largest casinos on the Las Vegas Strip are at a standstill. Both parties failed to reach an agreement last week over a new 5-year contract with MGM Resorts and Caesars Entertainment. And the Culinary Workers Union is also currently in talks with Wynn Resorts. Right now, shares of those casinos down. We have MGM down more than 1.5%, Caesars down 3%, Wynn Resorts is down nearly 2%. About 4,000 union members at Mack Trucks are on strike. More from Bloomberg's Dan Schwartzman.
About 73% of workers rejected a tentative agreement, which was actually recommended by the leaders of the United Auto Workers. The UAW claims include wage increases, cost of living allowances, and health care coverage. Mack Truck is owned by Sweden's Volvo.
That agreement would have hiked workers' pay by 20% with no increase in health care premiums. Mack Truck says it's surprised and disappointed a deal was not reached. In a post on X, the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, UAW President Shawn Fain says he's inspired to see members hold out for a better deal. Now, meanwhile, on Friday, Fain said that talks with big three automakers were making progress and the union would not expand its strike. That walkout is going into its 4th week. Right now, General Motors shares down about 1%. Ford down a fraction, and Stellantis down about a fraction right now. And layoffs, they're coming to DreamWorks. Variety reports about 70 staffers will be cut from its workforce, and that includes corporate roles, feature television, and technology departments. That's all in an order to cut costs. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. We'll have more Bloomberg Markets in just a bit. I'm Lisa Mateo, and this is...
Headlines and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. For now, investors shunning some of the riskier assets like stocks, but buying gold, global bonds, and the dollar With the sell-off in U.S. stocks that's been easing just a bit, technology and consumer discretionary stocks proving to be among the biggest decliners today. Energy stocks, they're climbing as oil jumps about to 4%, and the defensive stocks are higher. Among them, shares of RTX, defense industry, they're up 3.5%. Some Fed speak also. Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas President Lori Logan saying the recent surge in long-term Treasury yields may mean less need for the Fed to raise its benchmark interest rate again. S&P 500, 11 points lower at 42.97. The NASDAQ 100, 70 points lower. That's down almost 0.5%. Dow Jones Industrial Average is 48 points lower. That is down about 0.8%. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Matt and Paul.
All right, John Tucker, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Matt Miller, Paul Sweeney live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We want to continue to follow the story in Israel, the war there with Hamas militants. Roz Matheson joins us. She's the news director for EMEA, Europe, Middle East, and Africa for Bloomberg News, based in, I think, London. Roz, thanks so much for joining us. I know it's a busy, busy time here. I guess one of the questions over here that a lot of folks are asking, I'm sure it's the same there, is just, how did this happen? What happened to the vaunted intelligence of not only Israel, but everybody else in that part of the world, including the U.S. and the West?
Well, that is the ultimate question, and it may take weeks or even months until we understand some of that, because as you can say, this seems to have been an absolute surprise very early on Saturday morning that this kind of infiltration could happen into Israel itself. And Israeli intelligence is famed for its ability. They're known for it. They share their intel with their key allies, including the U.S. And so what went wrong here? Because this operation by Hamas must have been months in the planning. It was very intricate. It was very detailed. It was very carefully carried out. How is it that no one in the Israeli intelligence community got wind of this? And so obviously, lots of questions now that are going on for the Defense Force in all of that. And they're saying it's going to take them weeks, if not months, to try and understand where the failures were in this. But obviously very much caught by surprise. And you can see, that perhaps the recriminations that may come from that down the track, including for the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Right now, the country very much rallying behind him in this moment. But there are also questions already coming about the failure here of the government to have known about this.
So, Roz, as far as we know now, you had this multi-point breach of the Israeli border, right? The attacks and also hostage taking. Did the attackers then pull back into Gaza and other sort of cross-border areas? And does it look like they're trying to draw Israeli forces into those areas?
Well, in fact, if anything, they seem to have been trying to push further into some Jewish communities that are in that area that's very close to the Gaza Strip and in the south of Israel, and trying to push on into communities and towns. And some of that is about attacking Israeli military posts in the area. Some of it has been, unfortunately, about attacking civilians in the area. And in some cases, as you say, taking those civilians back into the Gaza Strip for whatever reason. Is that to use them as hostages for whatever purposes, but certainly drawing some of them back into the Gaza area. So it's about sort of just sending the message to Israel, you know what, you're not safe inside your own border. We can come for you, and we will. But it's also about sort of using hostages for sort of further purposes as this conflict goes on. I mean, there are real questions about whether this now leads to a full-scale ground invasion by Israel of Palestine territories, including the Gaza Strip. So the purposes of those hostages, well, one can only guess at that.
Do we know anything about personnel numbers, how many the attackers had? And do we know anything about equipment? I imagine they weren't coming in tanks, just shoulder-launched rockets and and machine guns. Or what do we know about that sort of thing?
Well, interesting. It was a fairly sophisticated operation. I mean, Hamas has been fighting in some measure for decades against Israel, and they've been supported over the years financially and in other ways by Iran. Of course, there are questions about how much Iran may or may not have been involved in this particular episode that we're seeing now. But these are sort of been carrying out guerrilla warfare of some extent, for years. So they're very highly trained. There are apparently systems of tunnels they may have used. They use mechanized parachutes to literally parachute themselves into Israeli territory, and quite an organized, coordinated operation. So this is not just sort of random groups roaming around. It is quite organized and sophisticated.
So, Roz, we've seen video coverage of, it seems like tanks massing, armed personnel carriers massing on the Israeli side. The reports this morning of a call-up of 300,000 reservists. Is it the expectation that Israel, at some point in the near future, will make a full-scale invasion of that part of Gaza?
It's certainly seen as probable. I mean, this is a severe attack on Israel. The high number of civilian casualties that we've seen, it will compel the government to act. In the past, they've retaliated in different ways. Maybe they've struck through sort of rocket fire back into the Gaza Strip. We're seeing that already. If they blame Iran, they tend to hit Iran's proxies elsewhere in the area. This goes beyond what we've seen in a very long time in terms of the attack, the level of the attack on Israel, which will probably lead to a much bigger scale retaliation. And that's why the idea of a full-scale ground war now really is on the table. I mean, the Israeli government's talking about months of campaign here, military campaign. This is not going to be over in the next couple of days. They're really going to turn the screws on Gaza. They're turning the water off. They're turning the power off. They're going to make life for people living in Gaza extremely miserable. So we really are looking at the prospect of a full-scale ground war now in the Middle East.
I mean, given the size of the attack, and the support that Iran has historically provided to Hamas and Hezbollah, it seems difficult to imagine the Iranians didn't know, even if you maybe say they weren't involved in the actual planning, which the Wall Street Journal has reported that they were, quoting unidentified members of Hamas and Hezbollah. What does this mean for Israel? I mean, in terms of market